Hey guys, welcome back. So with this one, we're getting into Carnage Volume 3, the full story, which picks up after the conclusion of Extreme Carnage, with it showing us how what began as a plan for the Carnage Symbiote and Cletus Kasady to reach godhood together, instead caused them to go their separate ways. And with that said, let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top to get all notifications so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so with how this begins, we're just thrown into the action with us seeing this crazy anomaly and Detective Jonathan Shade running directly into it. And off the bat, we really don't know this guy, but we get to learn quite a bit about him as this story continues. But really, with how we're thrown into this here, he's narrating what he describes as almost an out-of-body experience, with him seeing himself running into what'll probably kill him, and how he didn't expect for things to go this way in the beginning, which is where we then head to shortly after. Because prior to this, Detective Shade had made his way out to a crime scene to investigate the most recent attack performed by a serial killer that they called the Artist, which the police were informed about through an anonymous tip. And with him coming here and seeing this, he's able to quickly confirm that this is the actual work of the artist rather than just some copycat. Which in one way is not only us seeing how good of a detective Jonathan Shade is, but it's also giving us a preview of how deeply invested he is in his work, and we'll talk about why that is a little later. But while he's here, suddenly this body starts moving, and a ton of butterflies just burst out of its stomach, which initially looks like a deviation from what the artist has done before. But John Shade quickly recognizes that this isn't a deviation, but rather the artist has always been theatrical, and these changes to his quote-unquote performance, they're more like escalations than deviations. And Shade also goes on to say that it wasn't the artist who called in this anonymous tip, because he's not doing this for public attention, but instead this is a coded message that the artist is using to call out to someone else. Which now begs the question, who is the artist trying to reach out to? To where from here we then see the blood drip into a very familiar spiral pattern. But after this, we then head over to the creepy setup of Kenneth Neely, the artist, who really for the most part doesn't work in just one location, with him traveling abroad to commit these different murders. But at this point, he's bound a man by the name of Dave Speakman, and Neely is explaining to Speakman his backstory, beginning with his father, and he goes on to tell him that his father was a mortician. He spent days making the dead look better than they looked when they were alive. His father worked for the city, which meant he got all the worst cases, from prison beatings to murders, horrible accidents, victims abandoned and alone. And when Kenneth Neely was a boy, he would watch his father work and he would ask him, why would he spend so much time making the dead look beautiful? Why would they care? They're already dead. And the answer that his father gave him was all things must be beautiful in the kingdom of God. And his father went on to die of leprosy at the age of 63. Which from there had Kenneth Neely thinking, well okay, that was the way that his father's God chose to end him. But moving forward, he continued to follow his father's beliefs to an extent, with him still believing that all things must be beautiful in the kingdom of God, but for Neely, he's doing this for a different God. So he then cuts Speakman, letting him bleed out, as he goes on to explain that what he's been doing with all of these different bodies is actually him calling out to his God, who he discovered when he saw all of the dragons flying around in the sky, and eventually the mark of God upon someone's head. And that someone is Carnage, who we then find at this point has now finally answered the call of Kenneth Neely. But before we continue, we then see that Detective John Shade has been called into the emergency room at an ungodly hour, because as it turns out, Dave Speakman is still alive. The EMTs brought him in, and though he's lost a lot of blood, the doctors were still able to stabilize him. And from here, with talking to Speakman, he gives a statement to both detectives, Booth and Shade, letting them know that he'd cut himself free with a scalpel, which is how he escaped. But then he goes on to tell them what he remembers from the story that the artist had shared, which were details about his father and him dying of leprosy. But then Speakman goes on to say that there was someone else there who the artist was talking to, and that person was the devil in the flesh, who Neely kept asking to take him. And from here, when we go back to Kenneth Neely and Carnage, it's here where Neely is going on to tell Carnage how he's followed his work for so long, but he's heard rumors of how Cletus Kasady is gone, and now it's only the Carnage Symbiote himself. And really, this is something that's a product of the story that has been building up from Carnage Born to Absolute Carnage to Extreme Carnage all the way up to here. And I have those links down in the description in case anyone needs to get caught up. But throughout the course of this playlist, we'll definitely be talking more about the symbiote going solo. But with Kenneth Neely bringing this up, he's asking the Carnage symbiote if he can be the next host, much like Arthur Crane had hoped to be in Extreme Carnage. But here, the Carnage symbiote responds to Neely by telling him that it's changed since being without Cletus Kasady. And at this point for Carnage, with him not really being interested in this offer, he tells Neely that he could just kill him, but he's noticed that Neely has gone a long way to show Carnage his work. So in return, Carnage decides to show Neely some of his, which from here takes the two of them to a warehouse in the South Bay Industrial District, where Carnage has Hydro Man strung up in a horrid state, binding him between his solid and liquid form. And it's here we find that Carnage has taken Hydro Man because he wants to steal from him the molecules that give him his power and apply them to himself, because Carnage believes within those molecules there's an infinite medium of infinite power that Hydro Man hasn't begun to comprehend. But this no longer matters because Carnage is taking it for his own. But through the course of doing this, Carnage goes on to explain to Kenneth Neely that he's no longer bound to the trappings and yearnings of Cletus Kasady, or any man for that matter. And sure, through the years, the Carnage symbiote enjoyed the torturing and the mayhem, but those were a byproduct of the preoccupation of Cletus Kasady, because everyone has their obsessions. And Carnage goes on to explain that Kenneth Neely is obsessed with him, but it's likely that Kenneth is someone else's obsession. And with Carnage saying this, it's here we find that Detective Shade has figured out that the artist is Kenneth Neely, and he's traced back the bodies which all connect in the form of a spiral, almost as if Neely has been chasing someone. But with going back to Carnage and Kenneth Neely, Carnage goes on to tell him that he's looking to escape these meager ambitions, and he's looking to find his own meanings and his own beauty in all of this, with what's happening here only being the first step, which really is the first step to the next phase. But nonetheless, Carnage is telling Neely that he doesn't see any point in bonding to a new host. But as this is happening, it's here where we see Detective Jonathan Shade pulling up to the scene of this chaos, which now takes us into the crazy moment that we were given a glimpse of at the beginning of this story, but this time around with way more detail, now that we actually know what's going on here. And as Carnage continues to take the powers from Hydro Man on a cellular level, he tells Kenneth Neely that he'd learned from Cletus Kasady that serial killers often have a fascination with keeping trophies. So he asks Kenneth, does he take trophies? And Kenneth is just like, well, yeah, I mean, you know, I take pictures, which he does for the memory of their transformation. But through the course of this, as Hydro Man is just begging for his life, Carnage goes on to explain that this is very much like a transformation, but the transformation itself, it isn't limited to just the victim. And more specifically, this piece that he's taking from Hydro Man, the piece of him which on a molecular level that made him water, it's a universal medium. So as Carnage goes on to imbibe this piece of Hydro Man, not only is it like him taking a trophy, but both him and his victim are transformed. And he goes on to tell Neely that this is like him and his victim being made beautiful by each other. And Carnage goes on to explain that this is something that he kind of got from Cletus Kasady, who was always interested in peering inside of people in more ways than just the literal sense. But then it's here where they find that Detective Shade has made his way into this anomaly in a nearly suicidal attempt to arrest Kenneth Neely. And for Carnage, with him seeing this, with him seeing Detective Shade risk it all for his obsession, Carnage is impressed because Detective Shade saw certain doom ahead of him, and he still chose to go forward and be transformed by it, which for Carnage, this causes him to see Detective Shade as someone very similar to himself, unlike Kenneth Neely, who shares more similarities with Cletus Kasady. And it's here where Carnage then tells Detective Shade, with him diving into all this energy being expelled from Hydro Man that's tearing him apart, he tells Detective Shade to survive. If he truly wants all that he pursues, then survive, and show Carnage how far he's willing to go. But before Carnage leaves, he gives Shade a piece of himself to help Shade pull himself back together. But then from here, with Carnage leaving with Neely, the next thing that we see is Detective Shade waking up violently in the hospital, with only Detective Booth there at his side to make sure he's okay. But with Jonathan Shade now awake, it's here where Detective Booth fills him in on how he got here. And Booth tells him that they found John laying in a puddle of blood, water, and a bunch of organs, and it looks like he'd been in some kind of explosion. But when Booth asks him what did he see, did he find the artist, John just tells him that he doesn't really remember. But as John gathers himself, he goes on to tell Booth that Neely was there. He saw Neely there, along with someone else, but he can't remember clearly and it's all a bit of a blur. And as you can imagine for Detective Booth, the lack of details isn't really helpful and is pretty vague like his talk with Speakman. So he just tells John to take it easy and rest up and they can get back to it later. But for John, he's like, no way. He saw Neely there and he almost had him. But then Booth lets John know that he'd been in a coma for 2 days. The doctors say that he's physically fine, but the chief's not letting him get back out there without a full eval. And as for all the blood and guts that were found at the scene, they all got taken away by some guys in black suits who said that they all belonged to some top secret asset. And the chief blames John for this. But with Booth leaving, he tells John to get some rest, he'll go after Neely, and he'll keep John in the loop. But when he leaves, John realizes a few things, cause for one, Booth was the only person who showed up to make sure that he'd wake up. And aside from that, John really doesn't have anyone to call to let them know that he's okay. Which right here in this moment shows us the main reason why John is so good at his job, because it's all that he really has. But then from here, when John notices the sliver that Carnage had left him, a wave of memories that aren't his own, followed by an insane bloodlust, just come rushing in. So immediately John just goes out the window, with him realizing that he's been physically changed because of what the Carnage Symbiote gave him, which unfortunately included the memories of Cletus Kasady, as well as his lust for blood. But for John, he plans to use this to catch Neely and the Carnage Symbiote, with him now being stronger and faster. But at the same time, he also realizes that this bloodlust that came along with it may become a liability. But he remembers the symbiote telling him, show me how far you're willing to go. And for John, he's willing to go all the way to catch both of them, to catch all of them. But just after this, we then head over to a motel with both Neely and the Carnage Symbiote, where at this point Neely, he's asking the Carnage Symbiote what he meant back there when Carnage said that Shade was on a similar journey. And with Neely asking this, it's pretty obvious that he's jealous. But Carnage lets him know that if anything, Neely should be flattered, because Neely is the reason that Detective Shade took the leap to begin with, because he's the detective's dark mirror. Because when Shade looks into the glass hoping to see himself, he sees Neely, and the detective hates him for that. And this is something that Carnage knows all too well when it comes to Venom. So Carnage tells Neely that what he's done is given the detective the ability to reach through that glass, which ultimately is where this is going with Carnage, and him reaching through the glass to Venom. But with Carnage telling Neely that he's given the detective the ability to come after him, Neely freaks out. But Carnage lets him know that it's not to destroy him, but rather to transform him, which really is just Carnage giving Neely the opportunity to be made beautiful like all of his victims, since for him, unlike them, he hasn't changed. But after dropping this revelation on Neely, Carnage invites him to tag along for his next kill. But then from here, we head over to Detective Booth, who's going back to his apartment only to find John Shade on his couch going through his files, with him knowing Booth to be the type to bring his work home. But looking through these files, John tells Booth that he remembers it was Hydro Man. It was his blood and remains that were found at that crime scene. But with hearing this, Booth is kind of like, well, I thought you couldn't remember anything. But for John, instead of sharing the details about what Carnage gave him, he just tells Booth that it's starting to come back to him. But as John continues, he goes on to tell Booth that Neely and the Carnage Symbiote are moving together. And amongst the two of them, the Carnage Symbiote is running the show. But with knowing this, if they're able to track the Carnage Symbiote down, then they'll get their man, because Neely is going to be with them. And as it stands, the Carnage Symbiote is working on a way to change itself, alter itself, become something else, something more. And so far, Hydro Man was just the first victim, because Carnage is now going after supers who have powers that he wants. To where from here, we then find that next kill that Carnage was talking about, which is none other than Dr. Jonathan Owen, aka Spot. Alright, so for this one, we jump into what the Carnage Symbiote would describe as the early stages of the Carnage Symbiote being in the pursuit of something that was initially the idea of Cletus Kasady. And like we'd seen, this had began with Carnage kidnapping Hydro Man and stealing his powers on a molecular level, which that in of itself was not only just a visceral demonstration of what could have been the Carnage Symbiote bonding with Hydro Man, copying his abilities and moving along in a similar fashion to what the Venom Symbiote did with giving Eddie Brock many of the abilities of Spider-Man, but as opposed to pursuing the symbiosis method, which isn't always in 100% copy and paste, the Carnage Symbiote is opting for taking the power from the source and applying it to himself in order to make the Carnage Symbiote become something else entirely. And when we come back, it's here we find that his next victim is none other than Dr. Jonathan Owen, the Spot, who for the Carnage Symbiote, much like Hydro Man, he's come here for Dr. Own's abilities, believing that he has severely underutilized his potential as well. And so for a quick moment, I want to do a bit of a rundown on the history of Dr. Jonathan Own. Because a while back in our talks on Symbiote Spider-Man, we were shown that Jonathan Own was roommates with Quentin Beck back when the two of them studied at MIT, and with Quentin Beck going on to become Mysterio. Jonathan Own, who had been working for the Kingpin, had later been given the request of reproducing the powers of Cloak and eventually his partner Dagger. But at this point, Fisk was only able to get a reading on Cloak by using advanced surveillance devices to capture a read on his radiation signature, which happened during the recent attack from Silvermane. But with having this data, Fisk ordered for Dr. Jonathan Own to reproduce this radiation signature so that he could artificially mimic the abilities of Cloak. But later that evening, after all the technicians had left for the night, Dr. Own stayed in the lab working overtime, pushing the radiation synthesizer to its limits with the hopes of producing a successful demonstration that he could show to the Kingpin the next day. And it was here where he successfully got it to work, creating a huge circle of darkness, similar to a black hole but without the gravity pull. But even with producing this success, radiation began quickly pouring out of the machine, causing this hole to soon after collapse. So before losing it, Dr. Own stepped inside, believing that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And with going inside, he passed out, only to then wake up in a dimension of half darkness and half light. But for Dr. Own, with him entering into this dimension for the first time, he eventually found a large group of spots, which were likely the disruption that was created when he made his way here. So he made his way back to them, with the theory of that being his way home, which was a theory that was correct. But with him passing back through that spot and making his way home, he had then found that the radiation transformed his entire body, covering him with spots, giving him the ability to recreate this phenomenon. But at this point, with Carnage coming after him, Dr. Jonathan Own has no idea what's going on. Because as you could imagine, he was just minding his business, and then out of nowhere, Carnage shows up and he's coming for his head. But with Own asking Carnage, what is this? What is he doing? What is this about? The Carnage Symbiote really just gives him the short version of the explanation, with him telling Own that he's come here for access to the spotted dimension. And for Dr. Own, initially he tells Carnage like, hey man, I could just help you. But rather quickly he realizes that Carnage is here to kill him and just take it. Not really sure what gave that away. So in a panic, Dr. Own throws spots everywhere, and Carnage reaches into nearly all of them. Which for Own, this is the type of things that nightmares are made of, because at this point any one of these spots could have a scythe coming through it. So from here, Own just tells Carnage that he's gonna have to catch him first. But then immediately, Kenneth Neely, who we've seen tagging along with Carnage this whole time, he grabs Dr. Own by the leg, screaming, I got him, I got him. Which from here, like Neely, he's not enough to stop Dr. Own. But with doing this, it causes enough of a panic for Own to quickly try to make an escape without putting too much thought into it. So when he makes another spot and jumps through, on this end, Carnage goes for a slice and ends up cutting off Neely's hand. And on the other end, Own ends up running right into another scythe from Carnage, which quickly goes in, out, and around him. And after this, the next thing he hears is, "Get over here!" Fatality. With Carnage pulling and slicing Own into countless little spotted pieces. And now with Kenneth Neely just screaming in excruciating pain, which I mean is kinda what you get for trying to be the best friend of Carnage. But it's here where we see Own give his last words, with him saying to Carnage that he can't kill him because Own has the spotted dimension and he will return. But in response, the Carnage Symbiote just tells him that he's counting on it, as he picks up one of the spots and he applies it to himself. And from here, Carnage doesn't even bother to help Neely recover his hand, which is something that we know could be done because of what we'd seen with Eddie on Venom Island. But instead, he just gives Kenneth a pat on the head, and he tells him that perhaps he has grasped what it would mean to be a suitable host after all. Which for Kenneth, this sounds like Carnage is gonna fix his hand. But instead, the Carnage Symbiote is like, nah man, that's just a scratch, let's go. And he opens a spot, sending them to their next location. And when we go back to Detective Jonathan Shade, who's currently at the police precinct, getting ready to write up some reports, but as it stands, this sliver that Carnage had given him, it's nearly driving him insane, with it constantly talking to him and telling him that he should attack his co-workers, and it gets to the point to where Detective Shade is like enough, so he then races to the roof to have a conversation with this thing and figure out what it wants, because all Detective Shade knows is that this voice had just come along with the symbiote goo that Carnage gave him so that he could pull himself back together, and it ends up telling John that it's just bored, it wants something to do. preferably something that involves stabbing and a bit of minimal carnage at the least. But throughout this conversation, Detective Shade and this Carnage Slither, they more or less end up coming to a middle ground, with John being stuck with this thing for the time being, but with it telling John that if he wants to catch Carnage and Kenneth Neely, then John's gonna have to break some of the rules to do so. So eventually John asks the Slither, what does he call it, so he doesn't go around looking crazy talking to himself. So it tells him that he can call it Cletus. But from here, John ends up making his way over to a crime scene that's being investigated by Detective Booth, who's taken John's place on the case since the chief thinks that John has just lost it, with him going on about different supers, which is out of their jurisdiction and the quickest way to get this case taken from them. With Booth telling John that he shouldn't be here, he shouldn't be anywhere near here. Cletus shows John a bit of a look at what it would be like if he were to just beat this guy to death, as a way of letting Shade know that if he wanted to blow off a little bit of steam, they could do this right here and now. And with Detective Booth seeing John kind of blank out for a minute, John of course doesn't tell him what it was, but instead he just says that it was a headache and he leaves. But at this point for John, he saw what he needed to see already, because earlier when he ran up to the door, he saw the open brochure with a map that was labeled eastward, which then let him know the direction that Carnage was heading. But with Detective Shade not really knowing what's eastward, aside from a bunch of abandoned factories and mills, Cletus then goes on to tell Detective Shade Carnage is still following his plan, which means that Carnage went out east to go after Dr. Jonathan Owen. And Cletus knows at this point there's a high probability that it's too late for them to do anything about that. So in response, Detective Shade is like, so what, should I call it in? But then Cletus tells him that he probably shouldn't, because if Detective Shade calls it in, he's gonna also have to explain how he got that information. So from here, Cletus tells him that they should just skip to the next step, which is the observatory, and meet Carnage there. Which at this point, with Carnage going to the observatory, this is something that Detective Shade just doesn't understand. And lucky for us, neither does Kenneth Neely, who at this point is with Carnage at the observatory. And at this current time, he is begging the Carnage Symbiote to make sense out of all of this. Cause like we'd seen, Kenneth had lost his hand, and he believes that the least that Carnage could give him at this point is an explanation, which Carnage does in just a moment. But first he tells Neely to look around the observatory at all the other people who had given up so much more. But then Carnage goes on to explain that this was originally Cletus's idea, because back when him and the Carnage Symbiote were together, they'd seen Dr. Halliday on television speaking about Einstein-Rosen bridges and sending particles across dimensions. But this plan had truly began when Knull arrived on Earth with his dragons and gave Carnage a taste of power that him and Cletus had never dreamed of. So then later, when the conclusion of King in Black happened, when Eddie defeated Knull and became the new King in Black, Carnage believed that this should have been him, because after feeling the power of a god and then seeing all that power go to the one person that they hated the most, this caused Cletus Kasady to come up with a plan for a way to elevate himself and the Carnage Symbiote, so that with them not being able to become God, they would instead become the thing that kills gods. And as time passed, Cletus never acted on this plan, and with him gone, eventually the Carnage Symbiote believed that Cletus Kasady was just in his way. So it's here where Carnage then gets Dr. Halliday to power up her machine, as Carnage wraps himself around it and uses the powers that he had taken from Hydro Man and the Spot to take himself and Kenneth Neely to another realm. But as the two of them prepare to make their departure, Detective Jonathan Shade makes his way inside of the observatory in what is yet another chaotic moment, but this time, instead of him getting ripped to pieces and put back together, he grabs onto Kenneth Neely and Detective Shade is dragged along for the ride. But as they're all making their way from one realm to the other, Neely kicks Detective Shade in the chest, which from there sends him spiraling out of control in the space between realms. Alright, so previously on Carnage, True Detective, we followed the Carnage Symbiote to the observatory, where it used Dr. Halliday's machine to transport itself along with Kenneth Neely, so they can head to the next destination required to see this elaborate plan through. But with using this machine, which essentially was designed to create Einstein-Rosen bridges and send particles across dimensions, Detective Shade showed up, grabbing Neely just before him and Carnage passed through, which pulled him along for the ride. But unfortunately, while they were in transit, Neely gave Detective Shade a kick to the chest, which sent him tumbling through space and between a myriad of different dimensions. And at this point for Shade, the only thing that's holding him together is that piece of the Carnage Symbiote with the memories of Cletus Kasady, which is preventing him from being torn apart as he tumbles into the unknown. But in the case of Carnage and Kenneth Neely, we discover that they've arrived at their destination, which is Svartalfheim. But as soon as they get here, as you would expect, Neely, who's following the Carnage symbiote in hopes of being the next host, Neely's like, wait, we in another realm? And he starts asking all sorts of questions, but Carnage just reminds him that he had told him already they're here to kill gods, but they gotta up some elves first. And as they make their way, we're taken over to a ceremonious hunt that's being held by the Black Bile clan, who were once led by Malekith. And in this ceremony that's held every 16 years, the Dark Elves send out a group of 6 who are among the greatest of them. And amongst these who are chosen, you have warriors, wizards, witches, and woodsmen who will go out and tame one of the pups left by their wolf goddess, with it said that only one of them will return. But as we're shown the different elves who are going to head out, one of them by the name of Zeist, which is how I think it's pronounced, because it's spelled like the city just with an E on the end. But he steps forward having one hand and a crooked spine, and he makes the case that he wants to go because he wants to earn his place in the Black Bile. And with the way that he presents this, he says it like, well, you know, none of you guys really think nothing of me, probably gonna go out there and just die and be out of your hair, but if I live, I'll earn my place in the Black Bile. So essentially with him doing this, he's challenging whoever's their 6th, but as it turns out, there isn't a 6th. So they let him head out with the others, and it's highly likely that they're thinking what he said. He's probably gonna die out there, so they just let him go. But after some time passes, this group disperses, and we find one of these guys just running for his life, only to then get his foot ripped off by Carnage, who this guy believes is just some run-of-the-mill demon. But Carnage doesn't bother to correct the guy, because after he pulls the spear out of himself and returns it to the sender, the dude's no longer really listening to anything anymore, or at least for the time being. But with seeing this, Neely, he has some more questions. And at this point, Carnage is just like, look bruh, we're here for the wolf pup, just like these guys. And he goes on to tell Neely that if he wants to know more, he's gonna have to earn it. So from there, Neely's pretty much like, okay, well, what I gotta do? So Carnage tells him, somewhere out there, there's an elf with one hand and a crooked back. Handle him. So in response, Neely's kinda like, well, man, I never killed an elf before. And Carnage goes on to tell him, it should barely be a challenge, right? But as Neely goes on about his way to look for Zeist, Zeist ends up getting the drop on him, and at this point he lets Neely know that he's been watching him watching them, and also that he knows that Neely's been consorting with the demon. So he gives Neely an opportunity to explain himself, but also to make things go a bit smoother, Zeist casts a spell so that the two of them can understand each other's language. And right away Neely tells him that the demon made him do it. And he's like, the demon gave him a knife and told him to go after him, so it was either that or get killed. And you can tell right away that Kenneth Neely, he's kind of dancing around between telling the truth and just saying what he thinks will keep him alive in this moment. Because he flips to being very honest when he's asked, why didn't he just run? Because he responds with saying that he's not from this realm. And when Zeist asks, what does the demon want? Why is he here? What is he after? Neely goes on to tell him, why does the river flow? It is his nature, as it is his name, Carnage. And he goes on to tell Zeist that Carnage is here for the hounds, just like Zeist and the others. So Zeist puts his translation spell on Neely's knife, and he lets him know as long as he holds that knife, they can understand each other, to where from there he invites Neely to tag along with them. And as they head deeper into the forest, Neely asks Zeist, what is he gonna do about Carnage? And Zeist responds with saying that he's gonna let Carnage take out his competition, because either Carnage will take them out one by one, or they'll kill Carnage and be too tired to put up a real fight. But either way, Zeist sees waiting as his best option. But as we head back over to Carnage, who at this point has found a few of the other Dark Elves, while Carnage is fighting this guy, suddenly someone else cuts in, and it's here we find that Carnage has been converting these other Dark Elves, recruiting them for the time being, which shortly after is what he does to this one. And for a moment we see Carnage comparing the tradition that these Dark Elves were following to its former experience with Cletus Kasady, with saying how the both are like being tethered to a tradition, until eventually realizing that you've been listening to the echo of a voice long lost. Because really in the case of these Dark Elves, that's what this whole ceremony was about, because with the Black Bile clan, it's really just them reproducing what Malekith did to ensure that they still have someone in their clan who can prove to be now what he once was, which really just makes the whole tradition about proving that the Black Bile clan still has it rather than preserving a particular culture. But I mean, sometimes that can be two in the same. And for Carnage, the way that he sees this, alongside of what he's doing now, it's like him being liberated from Cletus Kasady and moving forward into his true potential. And after this, we then see that Carnage has taken the other 5 Dark Elves over to the cave to tame the hounds. And just outside, we find that Zeist and Neely have made their way there. But again, Zeist wants to wait in the hopes of either Carnage being dead or too tired to stand for a fight. But while they're waiting, Zeist and Neely have a bit of story time, where Zeist gives Neely a bit of his backstory, telling him how he was born with this condition, with his hand being mangled with the bones in his back. But even still, through the years, he did what he could to gain the acceptance of his people, only to eventually realize that he would never be anything more to them. They would never look at him and see who he was, but instead only what was missing. And eventually he stopped hoping for his people to lift him up. He just uses this as motivation, because he'd rather be a three-legged wolf than a dog on all fours. But with how this is done, as they go to move forward, it's implied that some time has passed, and this conversation was a bit longer than what we're shown. But as they leave, Neely tells Zeist that he doesn't know if he can go forward with this, and Zeist just tells him, "You will. You must. Can doesn't come into it. Grip your knife and drive the blade." But after this, we then see Neely meeting with Carnage by himself. And at this point, with Carnage believing that Neely accomplished what he told him to do, Neely goes on to express to Carnage that he's tired. So he asks again, what is the point of all this? Because Hydro Man and Spot, he understood. But in the case of these elves, or the hounds, it doesn't seem to be much of any gain. But Carnage goes on to let him know that he didn't kill all the hounds. He killed most of them, but then kept one, who Carnage goes on to say that he's naming Spike. But then he asks Neely if he actually took care of what he was supposed to. So Neely says yes, and he takes Carnage over to Zeist. And he explains to Carnage that Zeist trusted him up to the end. So Neely put a blade to his neck, folded it across, saying like Judas, he betrayed him with a kiss. But Kenneth said that Zeist wasn't made beautiful by this, and there was no meaning to his death. So Carnage tells him that Zeist represented Neely before, and much like Carnage, he also has to overcome the thing that he loved, the thing that they once believed defined them, which for Carnage was Cletus Kasady. To where then from here they head towards their next destination, which Carnage says is the place that people go when they kill something that they love, and that place is hell. But as they make their way, we then head back over to Detective Shade, who has been floating between forever and eternity this whole time. And while he's adrift, Cletus explains more of this to him, with letting Shade know, once Carnage has stolen all of these abilities and accumulated all of this power, any amount of resistance that the so-called heroes put up won't be enough. And Cletus tells him, unless you stop him. So of course Detective Shade is kind of like, why me? And Cletus lets him know that it's really more so of the case of Cletus, the piece of the Carnage Symbiote that Carnage gave to him, being the memories of Cletus Kasady. Because no one has ever known the Carnage Symbiote like Cletus. In the way that the Carnage Symbiote thinks, it's because of him. Because the real Cletus Kasady, he wouldn't whiz on the world if it was burning. No, he would pour gas on the fire and make s'mores. So now with this knowledge tethered to Detective Shade's bleeding heart, this is why it has to be the two of them. And it's also why Detective Shade must prepare himself. However, as they're drifting, Cletus gives Shade the heads up. And he tells him that powers greater than the two of them are going to reach into this void and pluck them out, which is something that happens immediately after when they're pulled out by Spider-Link. Though even still, I can't help but to think that it was really a bit of foreshadowing for something much further down the line. But it's here where Spider-Link introduces herself as the pattern maker, and with her bringing Detective Shade to Loom World, she lets him know that she sensed the fate of whole worlds resting in his hands because he holds a small end to a very long thread, and she notices that something has been wrong since she's tried to repair the Web of Life and Destiny, only to see it turn into a red ooze. And she goes on to tell him that her spider sense let her know that a small part of Destiny has fallen into the hands of a good man, and she would be a fool to ignore it. But for Spider-Link, who now is Pattern Maker, since the events of Spider-Geddon, she lets Shade know that her spider sense also told her that she needed to get him to Niflheim. And with sending him off, initially Shade believes that her spider sense is playing some type of cruel joke. But Cletus lets Shade know that they're on the right path, and in fact they now have the opportunity to actually get ahead of Carnage and put an end to his whole plan here. So with hearing this, John is like, okay, well what do we gotta do? And in response, Cletus says, simple, we kill Malekith. Alright, so at this point, with Detective John Shade making his way to Niflheim in hopes of finding Malekith before Carnage, while he's here, it isn't long before trouble finds him, and he's eaten by a huge snake. And of course, for Detective Shade, his initial response is panic. But Cletus, the piece of the Carnage symbiote that he has bonded to him, reminds him that he can do so much more with the symbiote that he has, as far as protecting himself instead of just being eaten on arrival. But with Detective Neely running into these unexpected obstacles, he also understands that doing things like fighting a giant snake cut into the head start that he has on Carnage, with Neely rushing to get to Malekith first, and elsewhere in Niflheim at the Frozen River, we discover that Carnage has made his way there as well, along with Spike and Kenneth Neely, which now sets us up for the race against time, as far as who's gonna make their way to Malekith first. And with them coming here, they're soon after met by a small army, which Carnage isn't too surprised to see, because Carnage assumes that his previous work in Svartalheim is the reason why he's arriving and seeing this much resistance early. However, we're shown quickly that that's not the case, because for Hela, the Queen of Hell, when she's informed about Detective Shade as well as a stranger with a Hellhound making their way there, though she's not certain of who Carnage is, she is told that the mind of Carnage is fixed on Malekith. But instead of Hela making any haste to get Detective Shade or Carnage out of there, instead she's just more or less like, let Hell do what Hell does best, because it's a place of trials. So let these visitors face those trials as well, which really just makes sense because it also gives Hela the opportunity to continue to observe, gather more information, and also get some answers of her own. But from here we then jump over to Malekith, who's been in Hell for quite some time now, because for him, after his defeat in the conclusion of War of the Realms, he's just been in Hell, enduring all kinds of torture with his eyelids sewn open so that he'll never blink and also have to watch for eternity. But to elaborate a bit more on the plot of what's happening here, because though it's mentioned and later on shown briefly, there's really not a lot of time spent on explaining that Carnage has made his way to Hell for Malekith to take away what remains of the Venom Symbiote that is still with Malekith. And this is why for Detective Shade, who's had the help of Cletus, the piece of the Carnage Symbiote that has been bonded to him, which has the memories of Cletus Kasady, this is why Detective Shade is rushing to get to Malekith first before the Carnage Symbiote does. But even with Shade finding Malekith first, he's asking questions like, what did this guy do to end up here? Almost as if he's trying to find a justification for sparing Malekith's life, as opposed to just killing Malekith to keep him away from Carnage, which for Cletus, just seeing Malekith here is enough. But with the way that this is shown, it's almost as if Detective Shade is going through a bit of a trial himself, with him needing to figure out and decide what he's gonna do with Malekith. But back over with Carnage, Kenneth Neely, and Spike, they're fighting this army, which again, as Hela described, this is literally a trial for them, rather than it being something like Hell's defenses attempting to stop them from taking one of its prisoners. But suddenly this quickly escalates for Kenneth Neely, as Rosfelg, the Sin Crier, swoops down on him from above, crying onto Neely his sins to show him what Hell truly is. And the crazy thing is just how this affects him, because for Neely, he's shown all of the murders he committed, which at the time, like we know, was him trying to make his victims beautiful, quote unquote. But as he undergoes this sin cry from Rosfelg, which is not like a penance stare from a ghostwriter, which only works if someone feels guilty, but instead for Neely, this sin cry strips away Neely's previous rationalizations, causing him to see everything that he had done for what it actually was, and it causes him to be the artist no more. But as Rosfelg pulls Neely's mind and bends it to its limits, Carnage grabs a hold of Rosfelg, and Carnage is more or less like, hey, do me, do me. So Rosfelg complies, expecting to get something like a similar result, but instead, when Rosfelg sees the sins of Carnage, at first he's overwhelmed with joy, with him thinking that it's going to be a pleasure to turn all of this back around on Carnage, because there's so much. But when the feed just keeps on coming and coming, as Rosfelg is nearly full from what he's seen, he then realizes that this is only the introduction. It's only the opening scene. The beat still ain't dropped yet. And already, Rosfelg just wants it to stop. But instead, he's just bloated with the all-knowing of Carnage overload, as he keels over in relief that it's done. And from here, Carnage hands Neely a sword, telling him to finish it. And though Neely lets Carnage know what Rosfelg had showed him and how he realizes that this is where he'll end up one day, Carnage lets him know, not unless you're a Viking, because there are plenty who have committed as gruesome acts as Neely for the more righteous cause and made their way to Valhalla. And Carnage goes on to explain to Neely how Rosfelg was just holding up a mirror to show Neely himself, but when he held up that mirror to Carnage, he had no clue that his sins were more abhorrent than his reflection. And this now should give Neely a better idea of who Cletus Kasady was and what it takes to be the host of Carnage. But then also with saying this, they make their way to where Malekith should be. But when they see that he's gone, Carnage immediately starts cussing out Cletus, because he now knows that the piece of himself that he had given to Detective Shade had told Shade where Carnage was going. Plus, Spike picked up the scent of another human, like Neely, which for Neely, with him hearing this, he's spooked out now that he knows that the detective came all this way. And for Detective Shade, who decided not to kill Malekith, but instead release him and just figure it out from there, he's having this back and forth conversation with Cletus in his mind, with Cletus telling him that he made a mistake and how he should just kill kill Malekith, but Shade just tells Cletus that he's a cop. So more or less he's trying to figure this out by doing it by the book. But then on top of that, there's also an extra incentive to keep Malekith alive, with Malekith telling Shade that he knows how to get him out of there. But as they continue, they're attacked by a rhyme giant. And for Malekith, he has a special level of hate for these guys, since they were the ones torturing him for so long, day and night, out in the cold, bending his mind and breaking his bones. So to Malekith, if he extinguishes every last one of them, he still doesn't believe that that'll be enough. And for a moment, it raises suspicion with Neely that Malekith is spending a bit too much time on this giant rather than just making a dash for the exit. But Malekith assures Shade that he knows the way out as he takes him to the Great Well. And he explains to Shade how it's told that this is from where all rivers flow, but it's really more like a cosmic river. And for them to use it, they have to go into the giant's fortress and get a key, which is more like a cosmic raft of sorts, so that they can use the Great Well and travel its cosmic waterways to their choice of wherever those rivers may lead. And with them getting there, we're also shown that Hela is informed about them slaying giants and making their way to the Well of all rivers. And if they acquire the Yort Spring, they're out of there. But for Hela, once again, she's like, sure, if they make it, they make it, because hell's not a prison, it's a ring of trials. And if they succeed at these trials, then by all means they can go as they please. But then with Hela giving it a little more thought, she mentions that great questions are asked by those who come here. And she considers herself saying that perhaps that she hasn't asked these questions hard enough. So with her noticing that the most curious of questions is roaming around in the ice in pursuit of these answers before they slip away, she makes the decision to nudge along the final trial so that she can have her answers when this is all said and done. And when we go back to Carnage and Neely, as Carnage is going on just talking about how Cletus betrayed him, Neely asks Carnage if they're just lost. And for a moment it feels like Neely really wants to say it like,
stop acting like you know the way ahead, like you know the rules. There are no rules, man. We're lost.
No. But of course he knows better because it's Carnage. And aside from Carnage going on about the betrayal of Cletus, it also comes to his attention that a hellhound can't sniff its way through a blizzard in hell. So essentially they've lost the scent of Malekith and Detective Shade. But then suddenly Hela shows up. And she gets straight to business, telling Carnage that she can help him find what he seeks, because for Hela, she wants to make sure that Malekith has earned his escape. And with Carnage hearing this, of course, he wants to know what Hela wants in return. So she tells him that she's seen where he's heading next. So she whispers in his ear what she wants Carnage to do for her when he gets there. And after this, we then go back to Malekith and Detective Shade, where we find Malekith just going through these giants and just indulging in all the revengeance that he can. But Detective Shade lets Malekith know that he's doing too much, because sure, they have a lead now, but they gotta use it to get out of here. But Malekith insists that he won't leave until all the rhyme giants are dead. And really, when you think about it, the test of just walking away, it's almost like a trial within itself, which obviously he's failing in this moment. And he goes on to tell Shade that he knew who he was setting free, and more or less if he has to go through Shade to kill the rest of these giants, then so be it. But suddenly a number of symbiote scythes come creeping up behind Malekith, yoking him up and revealing that Carnage is here. But instead of Carnage just killing Malekith, he sets him back down, almost as if he's giving him the opportunity to fight his way out of this, and more or less pass this final trial to earn his release. But as Malekith fights Carnage, he makes the mistake of believing that he has the experience of fighting other symbiotes because of what he remembers with who Venom was during War of Realms. But truth be told, while Malekith has been in hell, a lot has changed with symbiotes since then. And with Malekith losing the fight, Carnage lets him know that in spite of what he believed, he's not here to kill him, but instead he's come to take a piece of Malekith to add to his collection, which is an important piece. And it's one that Carnage would describe as not only important, but also the sweetest that he's added to his collection, with this piece being none other than Venom. Which, once again, for Carnage, the reason why this piece is the sweetest to him, it just goes back to what we were shown before, with Venom becoming the King in Black, being the reason that this whole plan was formulated in the first place. And when the original Cletus Kasady formed this plan, he sought to elevate the Carnage Symbiote so that together they could become the thing that kills gods. So for Carnage, obtaining this piece of Venom, to him it feels like he's gotten one step closer to becoming the equal of the King in Black. Alright, so jumping back in right off of the heels of our talk on Carnage going to hell to get Venom. After Carnage removed the Venom Codex from Malekith, Hela just threw Malekith's broken body over her shoulder and put him back where Detective Shade found him. Then she goes on to remove John Shade from hell with telling him that it's not his time to come here. At least not yet. And then next, we see Carnage explain to Kenneth Neely what he had taken from Malekith, showing him the Venom Codex and telling him how it's what a symbiote leaves behind after bonding with the host, and how it's like a unique signature or a memory of their symbiosis that the host carries even after they're separated. And Carnage goes on to tell Neely that it's similar the other way around, because the Codex works very much like how a symbiote continues to carry the inner workings of their host. And with hearing this causes Neely to then say it's like they're haunted by each other, which is an interesting way to put it, because we get an example of this as they head to their next location, while we instead go back to Midgard at St. Est's orphanage, which is a location that means a lot to Cletus Kasady. And this is something that we were shown back in Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1 in a story called Savage Genesis, when Peter was at the Bugle, retracing some of Venom's activities, with Peter believing at the time that a series of murders were committed by Venom. But while doing a bit of investigating at the Daily Bugle, Peter stumbled across a bunch of archived articles on Cletus Kasady, saying how Kasady was sentenced for 11 life sentences prior to his escape, but also these archived articles revealed new information to Peter about Kasady's past, like the fact that Kasady was raised at St. Est's Home for Boys in Brooklyn, and how there was this huge fire years back where one of the disciplinarian administrators' bodies were found in the rubble with their skull smashed. And though the police theorized that she fell and smashed her skull in a panic, Peter believed at the time that it was possible that it was actually Kasady's first kill. So after this, Peter made his rounds asking anyone who may have known Kasady to share whatever information they could, and from what Peter was hearing at the time, he was like, man, I'm starting to miss Venom. But with Peter eventually making his way to the St. Est abandoned orphanage, he had learned at this point from what he had heard that this was the only place that Kasady ever called home. And as Peter made his way inside to investigate and see what he can find, Kasady was inside, in his birthday suit, having a campfire with his old bear Binky. But I bring this up mainly to point out what this place meant to Cletus Kasady. It's the only place he called home, he called it his sanctuary, and it's the first place that he fought Spider-Man. But again, I bring this up because the significance of this location, it plays a huge role in the current agenda of Cletus Kasady. Because now when we fast forward to your modern day, at St. Est's orphanage, we find a kid by the name of Scott Rawson, who's doing this stream called Not So Spooky, where his plan is to do a live stream with him going inside the orphanage that there's been so many rumors and spooky stories about. But as soon as he walks in, the first room that he sees, it's squeaky clean, which makes absolutely no sense for a building that's been abandoned for decades. But as he's talking to his stream and telling his audience how the place looks so cliche, the comments begin to tell him that there's writing appearing on the wall behind him. So he turns around and he sees that it reads, "Time to put some skin in the game." And on the ground just in front of him, he finds that there's a scalpel that's been left there for him. So he picks it up, saying that he guesses this is where most scrubs would make their exit. And I gotta say that he's right, cause I would have been gone. I'd have been that scrub in a heartbeat. But he picks up the scalpel and cuts out a piece of skin from the palm of his hand, and as soon as he does, a door opens, leading deeper into the abandoned orphanage. So Scott walks through the door, and as he makes his way further in, he sees this eerie looking guy eating something off a plate while wearing a robe that looks very familiar to Scott, because his father had that same robe. But at this point, his stream is going crazy, and everyone's asking him to look at the plate. They want to see what the dude's eating. So Scott pans down only to see that this dude is having a full serving of FaceTime. Then suddenly, writing appears on this wall as well, saying, "Feed the man some face to eat, Scott Rawson." And for a moment, there's kind of this suspense where it has you thinking, is he gonna do it, is he not? And then he just comes staggering out of the room with pieces of his face missing, because he absolutely did do it. But as he stumbles into the next room, he hears a voice say, "Oh yes, let's turn that off, shall we?" As his phone begins to completely glitch out and lose signal, only for us to then find that that voice was the voice of Cletus Kasady. And with seeing this, I want to take a brief moment and talk about why he's here as well as what he's doing here. Because starting with the conclusion of Extreme Carnage, which is the last time that we saw Cletus Kasady, with it just being his consciousness in the Carnage Symbiote, going for a ride as he would say. But during this time at the conclusion of Extreme Carnage, when he went up against Flash and Tony Stark, who brought in his Extrymbiote, which was the suit that Tony made during King in Black, when he took one of Knull's dragons and used Extremis to separate it from the hive and combine it with his tech in this armor. But at this time, and also I got the link for the full video in the description, in case you may have missed our talks on Extreme Carnage, I got you covered. But at the conclusion of the story, while the consciousness of Cletus was in the Carnage Symbiote, he took the symbiote dragon from Tony and flew away while saying, "The whole world has seen what our hive did here, and they're gonna eat each other out of fear. The next time you see us, it's gonna be a different world." But it was after this event when Cletus Kasady and the Carnage Symbiote had their falling out, because next the Carnage Symbiote wanted to go on and execute the plans of Cletus Kasady so the two of them could become more. But for Cletus, with him now having the symbiote dragon with Extremis in the mix, they were already more powerful, so he wanted to settle there. And after rejecting the Carnage Symbiote, Cletus has just been at the orphanage with his Extrembiote since his physical body had been destroyed long before. So with how this played out, Carnage went on to acquire godhood, while Cletus Kasady has just stayed at the orphanage. And for Kasady, he's fine with this, because to him, Carnage gets to be a god out there, and he gets to be a god in here. But before I get too far ahead of myself, I just wanted to paint the picture of why Cletus Kasady's here, why it's this specific location, what he's doing here, as opposed to what the Carnage Symbiote has been doing, which is what we've been following this whole series. But for Kasady, with him seeing Scott make it this far, and actually feeding his face to get here, he's a bit surprised because he thought Scott was gonna leave, much like the others who came here before him. So he asked Scott, like, it was the robe, wasn't it? You want to know how the guy was wearing your father's robe? Because Kasady figures it was that curiosity that compelled Scott to take it a step further when most others would just leave. And with Scott going on to ask, what is this place? Who are you? Kasady just tells him that he's an orphan boy who grew up in this house. He's seen beyond these worlds, but even still, he keeps coming back here to this house over and over. And he's often wondered if this house was actually his first symbiosis. But to take it a step further and explain himself a bit more, Kasady tells Scott when he returned, reborn, in his new skin, in new armor, he melded with this place. He is this house, and this house is him. And from there he goes on to tell Scott how he knew about his father's robe, because when Scott gave a piece of his skin to the house, Kasady used that to peer into Scott's memories. And he goes on to tell Scott how he knows how hard Scott tries to be interesting and charming, and why he sneaks into houses at night armed with a phone. And Kasady tells him that this house let him know that Scott's looking for something beyond the mundane, when actually Scott himself is the door that needs to be opened to see that. So Kasady asks him if he wants to open the door to the next room. Scott says yes, and they make their way to where deeper inside the house, now that Kasady has sampled Scott's blood more than once, this now takes them into a labyrinth of Scott's memories. Memories of his father cheating on his mother, memories of Scott being a bully, and Kasady lets him know that this house goes as deep as we go in the interior. The only limitation is how much do you have to offer. So for a moment, Scott is like, no way, this can't be real. And Kasady takes that personally. So he tells Scott, like, don't you dare to confuse what's in here, the rich sensations of inner flesh, with your mundane reality and boring truths. So he opens the door and tells Scott if he wants to leave, he can go. But he tells him no one's gonna believe his truth because everyone's too frightened to believe anything beyond themselves. And Kasady goes on to show Scott different moments of his life, different moments of his truth. And he tells him life claws away the pieces until you're too old to notice, and then you die. And with Scott asking if this is real or not, Kasady asks in return, after seeing what he saw here, which one felt more real. So right away, Scott makes his decision, and he tosses his phone outside. And when he goes back in, he asks Cletus about what he mentioned earlier when he said that he'd been outside and far beyond, because Scott wants to know, with everything that Cletus saw, was there nothing out there in all existence that could keep him? And Cletus lets him know that he'd found someone once. They were inseparable. They were almost a god. And he goes on to tell Scott about the Carnage Symbiote without being too specific, but instead just saying how power changes people. It changes their perspective, and that someone who Kasady was with left him to pursue that greater power. But also, Cletus goes on to say that he believes that the Carnage Symbiote is going to make his rounds across the realms, across the universe, and eventually realize that everything out there doesn't compare or isn't as nearly as beautiful or even as real as what Kasady's created inside his interior, inside of this orphanage. And Kasady believes that there's gonna come a day when the Carnage Symbiote is done, where the symbiote will see this, understand, and return to him. But yeah, it's pretty crazy how on one hand the Carnage Symbiote, he says that Kasady rejected him, and on the other hand with Kasady, he says the symbiote left him behind. But as it stands, they both have very different opinions on what godhood looks like and what that means to each of them individually. So in our last talk, we jumped from the Carnage Symbiote over to Cletus Kasady to see what he was doing, as well as talk about some of the differences in opinion which have been going on between Cletus Kasady and Carnage. But this time around, as we return back to the symbiote and his god-killing conquest, we find that his next destination is Nidavellir, which is a place that has definitely seen better days, because prior to Carnage coming here, Eitri's dwarves at the Forge were nearly cleaned out, as a result of a story that we covered not too long ago in Thor God of Hammers, back when Odin's enchantments were being undone one by one, when the god Tempest made her way back here after being freed from Mjolnir and sought revenge on the dwarves who trapped her in that hammer. But fast forward to now, with the Carnage symbiote making his way here, we see him cleaning out what looks to be every last dwarf that was left over. However, there is one that he spared, who the dwarves had imprisoned, and this is the guy Carnage made his way here to find, to forge his new weapon, because this is Drorin, the brother of Eitri, king of the dwarves of Nidavellir, who was locked away because he believed that the forge needed to be destroyed, because time and time again, the weapons that the dwarves would forge, which were immense in power, would only carelessly be used by the gods in their meaningless conflicts, which would never end. And Drorin wasn't surprised that eventually it would be one of their weapons that would come back, destroy the forge, and end Eitri's life. But also with Drorin being the more talented craftsman between himself and his brother Eitri, this has caused him to be heavily sought after, and not just by Carnage but Hela as well. And with him refusing to help Carnage, the symbiote admires this bold stance, because he's got a soft spot for people who are willing to die for something. But Carnage goes on to let him know that he's not like these other gods who have come through here, looking for another weapon so they can run along with their same squabbles and petty conflicts, but instead Carnage wants a weapon that'll kill those gods, and when they're gone, kill some more. A blade with its singular purpose being Carnage. So Drorin agrees, and not necessarily for the reason of getting back at the gods who have long wasted the dwarves' talent, but instead for other reasons that he doesn't share initially. He just says that he needs materials and he needs an assistant. So given the situation with the forge being short-staffed, no pun intended, this creates a scenario where Drorin gets to have a bit of alone time with Kenneth Neely, and as he prepares the forge, he tells Neely that he's not sure what his companion means to him, but this guy's gotta be stopped, and he more or less lets Neely know that the two of them have got to stop this maniac, because if Carnage gets what he wants, he's gonna kill everyone anyway. And at first Neely's telling the dwarf like, hey, you haven't seen what he can do, and even though Neely has, he's not even sure if killing Carnage is possible. But for Drorin, just hearing that Neely is not opposed to the idea, that's enough for him. And as Neely goes on to express how he's noticed that Carnage has changed so much from someone he once admired to this thing that now wants to eradicate worlds, Drorin stops him right there, and he tells Neely that he underestimates the forge, because it's capable of creating weapons and tools, capable of destroying and building whole realities in a moment. And when the time comes to fashion this blade, it's likely that Carnage will want it melded to his body, much like the rest of his weapons. And when that happens, they will have an opportunity, a moment of weakness, where they can use the forge to turn Carnage into dust. And then next, he shows Neely a device that he had crafted while he was imprisoned all these years, which is capable of allowing him to travel to another world. Then he lets him know that all he has to do to use it is tap into the energy of the forge. But now with Carnage showing up, Drorin's worst fears come true, and this forge that he believes should have been destroyed long ago, it's about to birth a weapon so terrible that it's not gonna matter how far they run, and Drorin doesn't want to leave with that being his last act. But now with the preparations nearly done, Drorin tells Carnage that he kinda needs to know what he's building. So Carnage tells him that he wants a sword, and Drorin tells him yeah, he can make him a sword, but usually people who come here, they want something a little more specific. So Carnage hands him the Venom Codex, which he had taken from Malekith, while telling him within this codex, there is a design template for a blade, the greatest blade of them all black, the Necro Sword, the Butcher's Blade, which possesses power beyond knowing. But for Carnage, he's like, black is such an unimaginative color for a weapon of such exquisite taste. So he tells Drorin that he would like to make a few modifications. But for Drorin, when he sees the layout of this new weapon, though it seems challenging and thrilling, he soon realizes that he's gotta pull himself back because this weapon is too dangerous to be made. And as much as it would be a thrill to a master craftsman to forge something this incredible, Drorin knows that the dude that asked for this has gotta go. So moments later, when the time comes to forge this blade, he's prepared to do what must be done. So as the moment approaches, he asks Neely if he's ready, almost as if he's asking him if he's ready to forge the blade, when really he's asking him if he's ready to kill Carnage, which really Neely isn't, but the dwarf tells him that it's a simple plan, as long as Neely does his part, to where next he goes on to explain to Neely the forging process, and he tells him when a weapon is to be formed, before it is tempered, it's heated, for the most part in the forge. But this blade will be forged in a different sort of fire, as 1,000,000 fallen stars blaze in the sky each night. 100 pass just close enough to be pulled into the aperture above the forge, which uses Nidavelir's pull to draw the stars into itself, and only a few are needed. Too many would have enough heat to melt the heart of a planet. And there's only one substance in existence that could absorb that kind of energy, Uru metal. And this forge used to have hundreds of dwarves working on the metal all at once, but there's been no Uru here for a long time. So from here, Drowan tells Neely when the time's right, he'll draw that aperture all the way, and he'll see what it looks like when the heat of 100 falling stars burns the life out of their friend. And at that point, they'll use Drowan's device to get out of there. And with the plan laid out, Neely is still like, yeah, but what if it doesn't work? And Drowan's just like, it's gonna work. But Neely's still like, what if it doesn't? And Drowan just tells him, hey, if it doesn't work, then it won't matter where we run to. But also during this time, we find that Detective Shade has made use of the Yort Spring by way of some methods that he's really not proud of, with him having to kill a giant to get the key, and now Cletus, the piece of the Carnage Symbiote that he's been bonded to, fills him in on where Carnage went next. So John uses the key to take the two of them to Nidavellir. But as they arrive and begin to make their way closer to the forge, Cletus tells Detective Shade that he's proud of him, like yeah, Shade could have gone home, but no, he chose to continue his pursuit. And it goes on to tell Shade that he's looked past the veil. He knows what's out there now. He's seen symbiotes, space, spiderlings, elves, and giants, and John is colored so far out the lines that he'll never want to go back to the little box again. And for John, he's struggling, telling Cletus that he's wrong, almost as if John wants to agree a little bit. Meanwhile, back inside the forge, Carnage is ready to get this thing going, cause he's hot. But soon after, the stars begin to pass over, so they open the aperture, pulling them in just like the dwarf had planned, right on top of Carnage's head. And it just has Carnage looking like he hopped in the shower without checking the water temperature. But with doing this, the dwarf's plan is successful. But before he leaves, he tells Carnage that he should have let him rot in that prison. And he goes on to ask Carnage, like, why would he believe that he'd forged this weapon after denying numerous gods? Why would he just say yes to making something this crazy? But finally he tells Carnage that he can squirm, he can lash and whip all he wants, but there's nothing in all existence except Uru metal that can absorb the amount of energy coursing through Carnage right now. And there hasn't been any Uru metal in this forge, not since the dwarves who worked it perished. And he tells Carnage, this is it. This is how you die. Even if a mote of you continued to exist after a few moments, it would be a miracle. And then he looks to his left and he sees Detective John Shade. And this guy's looking rough. But right away Shade asks, where's Carnage? And Neely tells him, it's over. You can stop now. We killed Carnage. And right there Shade starts to freak out and slowly approach Carnage, reaching his hand out, while at the same time it's like he knows that he shouldn't, but he still does. And as soon as they make contact, Carnage breaks out. And I'm gonna tell you right now, this right here looks like a great time to use that little Rubik's Cube and get up out of there. Because now with Carnage free, Drowan had told him everything he needed to know. So next, Carnage reaches out to all the dead dwarves around the forge, and he pulls the Uru from their corpses, in their dead lungs, under their nails, buried in their skin. Carnage extracts every drop that he can, with it allowing him to absorb the energy that was eating away at him, using the Uru to restore and reforge himself stronger than he was before. And with him naming the new weapon All Blood, he quickly impales Drowan while telling him that he made a promise to Hela that he would send him to her in one piece. And then next, Carnage makes his way to Detective Shade, who's now dying since he doesn't have that piece of Carnage to hold him together. But because Shade saved Carnage's life, Carnage tells him in return he chooses Shade to be his new host. And from here, this takes the attention of Carnage over to Neely, who at this point, Carnage is looking at him like a traitor. So Neely quickly scrambles for Drowan's device, and he uses it to take him to the one person who might know how to stop Carnage, who of course is none other than the original psychopath, Cletus Kasady. Back on Earth, at the orphanage, where Neely makes his way in to meet the other side of this chaotic coin. Alright, so for this one, we come back just after Kenneth Neely had betrayed the Carnage Symbiote, when he realized the ridiculous scale of destruction that Carnage had set out to achieve, because murdering all of existence is a bit too much even for this lunatic, which is why he made his way to go see Cletus Kasady, with the hope that Kasady would know how to stop the Carnage Symbiote, since he was the original host. But with Neely making his way to Cletus's House of Horrors, it's not as welcoming and cuddly as he may have expected, because initially Neely tells Kasady that he is like him, which is something that we'll get back to in a moment as far as what Neely means by that. But as you would have guessed, Kasady's response to this stranger, it's pretty much like, you might have seen me in the street, but Neely, you don't know me. When you holler when you speak, remember, you don't know me. Because he goes on to tell Kasady that he's the artist and how he transformed 33 people, only for Kasady to slap his hand away and more or less tell him to get his numbers up. And shortly after, he shows Neely a small example of how the two of them are not the same, by using the house to recreate a scene of a truck stop that Kasady visited a few years back, which for Neely, this is his first time seeing what the real Kasady is capable of doing here. And he is just blown away at the level of detail that Kasady was just able to conjure up and make tangible just from his memory, which, like we talked about before, this is what Cletus Kasady has been up to since him and the Carnage Symbiote went their separate ways, with him being a god in here and Carnage doing his thing out there. So Kasady takes a moment to inform Neely about how he's had visitors from time to time, like our good friend Scott Rawson from issue 8, who would show up at this house, and every time he would just have fun with these different visitors until he got bored, and after that it's curtains. And it doesn't take Neely long to realize that he's quickly approaching that moment, so he begs Cletus to understand the reason why he came here, which was to get his help. But for a moment, we then travel back over to Nidavellir, where, like we'd seen, Detective Shade has now been taken in, literally, as the new host for the Carnage Symbiote, which is something that Shade would describe almost like his fate was sealed the first time that the symbiote lent a piece of itself to him to stitch the detective back together, as if everything Shade had done up to this point would have only led to this outcome. But while he's being absorbed, he tries to tell the Carnage Symbiote no, because he doesn't want this and he's a good man. But Carnage just proceeds to take him in, while telling John that he's not a good man, he's a curious one. And at this point, there's no turning back. And when Carnage tells Detective Shade that they're just gonna make their way to the next destination, to the next target, hearing this just has Shade like, how much power do you need? Because as it stands, Carnage is crazy powerful right now with all the abilities that he's taken alongside of his new weapon, the All Blood. But Carnage just tells Detective Shade that there's calculation behind all this, and as they make their way, Carnage takes a peek into the memories of Detective Shade to discern whether or not Jonathan Shade is truly a suitable host. And the first memory that this takes them to goes back to a time when Shade's old partner, Clyde Polk, punched Kingpin in the face, which is a memory from not too long ago with Fisk being the mayor at the time, which I think takes us back to about 2016, 2017, Charles Soule, Daredevil issue 600, or somewhere around that point during Marvel Legacy, because we're not told exactly when, we're just told that it was years ago. But in this altercation, Clyde confronted the Kingpin because he was tired of the guy consistently getting away with murder. So he brought a bunch of pictures that he had taken saying he had proof. But Fisk was just kind of like, whatever. And he tells this guy Clyde like, hey, if you like taking pictures, I can get you a job somewhere. And he even goes as far as to say that Clyde should probably listen to Catherine and take that trip to Scotland so he can cool off and clear his mind a bit. And as soon as he says that, Clyde gets ready to shoot him because he's fed up. And the Kingpin just had 4 witnesses who were all in 4 different states, butchered in under 48 hours. But for people like Fisk, they do this and nothing happens. Charges just roll off their back and the truth just bends around them. So at the time, of course, John took the gun from his partner Clyde, and he tells him that he can't do this. But he also told Clyde to trust the system because Fisk will get what's coming to him. But as we know, that never happened, because later on, after Luke Cage became mayor, Wilson Fisk more or less just went on vacation. He got married with Typhoid Mary, and now he's just kicking back having a good time. While on the flip side, Clyde, he kept drinking, he got a divorce, and life just spiraled downward for him. And though most would look at this like John Shade did the right thing, he stopped the man from killing the mayor. The way Carnage sees this, it's like Jonathan Shade let Wilson Fisk live when he could have stopped him all those years ago. So he tells him, what a disappointment. Perhaps I chose my new host poorly. But going back to Neely and Kasady, we find that Cletus is taking a moment to hear Neely out. and with Neely telling him the whole story of how Carnage is on his way to swallow the gods and make suns disappear out the sky. At first, it seems like Kasady's not paying attention as he eats his homemade pancakes, but then he stabs Neely's hand and tastes a drop of his blood so that he can take a look at Neely's memories and get to know Neely a little better if he's to consider leaving with Neely and helping him out. And right away, this causes the place to change into a memory from back when Neely was doing his artistry and he was preparing the body of the victim that we'd seen in issue 1. And while they're watching this, Kasady picks up this jar of butterfly larvae, which he sewed up inside of the guy so they would fly out later. But what's seen as Kasady asks, like, where'd you get this? And Neely tells him he got it from a guy he knows at the zoo, which right there just cracks Cletus up. So of course, with Ken being an artist, he's sensitive about these kind of things. So he slices Kasady's throat, only for Kenneth Neely to quickly regret it shortly after, because he then takes off telling himself that that was just dumb. Cletus Kasady was the only guy who could have helped, and now he's possibly dead. And while he's running with the scalpel, he thinks for a minute like, yeah, I should probably leave this here, which in theory is a good idea. But when he tosses it back to get rid of it, Cletus Kasady picks it up and he appears in front of Neely holding the scalpel, which is just his twisted way of showing Neely that he had never left. And in the way of like almost a last request, because at this point Neely's pretty sure he's not leaving here alive, but almost like a last request, Neely asks Cletus, what is he now? Because if he doesn't have the Carnage Symbiote, then what does that make Cletus Kasady? So Kasady gives Neely the breakdown of how his human body had been destroyed long ago and how he was brought back through his codex that was in Carnage, as well as the events leading into and after Extreme Carnage, where after that story, both Cletus and the Carnage Symbiote went their separate ways. And Cletus goes way more into depth with this explanation that he gives Neely, which is all of the same information that we talked about earlier on this playlist when this Cletus, the real Cletus Kasady, showed up. So I won't run through all of that again, but if you need to go back and check it out, I got the link down in the description. That'll get you caught up. But after Kasady tells Neely about the breakup between him and the Carnage Symbiote, Neely tells him that it must be hard finally being the bystander, which right there just has Cletus like, what are you talking about? But Neely goes on to tell him, all these years you've been playing to an audience of one, something closer than a symbiote or a twin brother, which right there has Cletus warning Neely to choose his words carefully. But at this point, Neely don't even care, because what's Cletus gonna do, kill him? He's made it clear he's about to do that anyway. So Neely goes on and he gets more specific by telling Cletus when him and Carnage were together, there was no distinction between the both of them. And now that Cletus doesn't have Carnage, Neely asks again, what are you? What are you without the Carnage Symbiote? Which goes beyond just asking Cletus how he's able to do what he's doing, which is what Cletus thought Neely was asking initially. And with him asking Cletus what he is without the Carnage Symbiote, Cletus tells him that he's still Cletus Kasady, only for Neely to let him know everyone's forgotten what that means. Everyone's forgotten the knives behind the teeth. And saying that gets Kasady to think for a moment. And then he tells Neely that he's probably right. And he can see why Carnage kept him around. So Cletus drops him and he walks out the door saying, come on, let's go. We're gonna give the people what they want. We're going to give them the Cletus Kasady show. Which now not only brings Cletus Kasady outside, like he outside with it again, but also this now has him ready to put on a show. And next, when we see the two of them at an actual diner, Neely expresses a bit of hesitation with him not being sure if they're actually here. Which I mean, after what happened at the orphanage, I don't blame him. And he also lets Kasady know that they don't have much time to waste. They've got to go after Carnage. But Cletus tells him this is about him, his goal, his plan, his show. Which gets to popping off in just a bit. Cause first, Cletus starts yelling about their order taking forever, so one of the guys there tell him to bring it down a notch and to just be patient cause he's eaten enough already. And then Neely asks this guy if he's ever heard of Cletus Kasady. And the guy's like, yeah, I've heard of who that is. You mean Carnage, right? And with Cletus, who's sitting right there, he says he's tired of people always confusing them, and perhaps this will help. So he shows his teeth, so to speak, and he tells this guy that he's the nasty one just before taking him out. But also with Kasady doing the whole tasting blood and looking at memories thing, which now has become a part of the Cletus Kasady show. With him doing this, he discovers that the guy he just decapitated, as well as a few others there, had a lot of stuff going on, like Dominic, who left the diner to open a record store, but his rent shot up, so that didn't work out, and he had to come back and work at the diner. And then you have Kurt, who was planning on cashing out his 401k so he can buy Todd's diner. But that's no longer going to be happening because Kurt doesn't have a head. And really the wild thing about all this with the Cletus Kasady show is that not only is he putting on a show for others to know who he is, but also with him tasting these memories, it's like that's the content he's consuming for that audience of one, which is himself. So it's like a two-edged sword. But while Cletus is just slaughtering Todd's diner and everyone in it, we find Dominic, who's one of the last people alive, trying to dial 911, but he's terrified and just dialing 92222, only for him then to get found by Neely, who takes this guy's phone and tells him not to call the police. And Neely goes on to tell him, like, if it makes you feel better, this guy, Cletus Kasady, is about to save the universe. And as Neely goes to destroy this guy's phone, he's stopped by Cletus, who tells Neely not to interfere with the Cletus Kasady show because he wants this guy to live a bit longer and call the police. And not only that, Kasady still wants his steak and eggs, which really at this point isn't a literal thing because he only lets this guy live for just a little bit longer just so he can call the cops, and that's it, which is pretty dark. And soon after this, we also find a ton of police outside of St. S orphanage who are given an anonymous tip from some kid that called who was watching Scott Rawson's live stream. And as it turns out, this anonymous tip was given to the police by Genki, who usually watches Scott Rawson's live streams on a regular. So of course he told Miles, and Miles went to check it out, in spite of him needing to be with his parents to help them move into their new place. But hey, when you're a superhero, you gotta do what you gotta do. But with Miles coming here, the police then get a call for them to head to Todd's diner. So Miles follows the police there as well. And unfortunately, like we'd seen, this is where the Cletus Kasady show is going down, because the police send in one of their negotiators with Sergeant Chloe outside and another officer going in just to see if anyone inside is hurt or if there's any special requests. But this negotiator isn't in there for long before they're thrusted right back out into a squad car with the words "Carnage Rules" carved into his back, which right away lets Miles know that Cletus Kasady is here, and it's giving him some absolute Carnage PTSD, because though the police believe this is a hostage situation, Miles knows Cletus Kasady better than that, and he's well aware that this thing is set up to be a slaughter, and this is a slaughter that we will continue another time in Carnage Reigns Alpha. Alright, so with us getting into Carnage Reigns, it's almost like we're just continuing from Carnage issue 12 and turning an extra page in that story, cause coming back now, we begin at the same location, Todd's diner, with Miles showing up and quickly realizing that he's about to be reunited with Cletus Kasady, cause the last time that these two met, it was during Absolute Carnage, which was a very terrifying experience for Miles, for a number of reasons, because not only was Cletus Kasady's ultimate meter full the whole time, but also Miles still has the image of Kasady breaking Scorpion's spine right in front of him, living in his mind rent-free. And on top of that, when Carnage inducted Miles into his horde, this literally took Miles into a dark place, because not only did he have a piece of Cletus Kasady in his mind, dragging him deeper into the hive, but also Miles remembers Kasady showing him what at the time he would say was his full potential, and not the good kind, which is something that nobody really needs to see, you know, their worst potential, because Miles even admits seeing something like that stains you, because you're just not the same after. And he even goes on to describe it as a bell that just can't be unrung, because even to this day, Miles is losing sleep over what happened in Absolute Carnage. And Miles still can't shake the words of Cletus Kasady, what he said to him when Cletus was in his mind, when he told Miles that he's just like him, and if Miles only lets go, he just might start to enjoy it, which are words that have been just haunting Miles with the idea that he may become a psychopath just like Cletus. But when Miles shows up, he notices that the police believe that this is a hostage situation, but he knows that there's no way that that's even close, because if Kasady's here, it's a slaughter. So Miles goes camouflage and makes his way inside. But as he makes his way inside, he can't help but to think about how he's supposed to be helping his parents move, and how if Kasady doesn't kill him, then his dad definitely will. And during this time, he's almost eaten by a wall, and I can't help but to think like, man, you need to get your head in the game, bro, because the Kasady that Miles is up against now, he has some new tricks up his sleeve. And Miles gets a taste of that pretty early, because when he makes his way into the diner, still camouflaged, crawling on the ceiling. The cook turns the light on, and he tells Miles to not leave any paw prints up there. Which in just about any other situation, this would have seemed to be close to normal. But with us heading into this from the Carnage series, we know that everybody in this diner is already dead, with the exception of Kenneth Neely. And with Cletus Kasady creating this replica of a regular night at the diner, he's able to make this very accurate since he has the blood and the memories of everyone who he slaughtered here. And as Miles skeptically walks around the diner, knowing that at least these people weren't here before, not when he first got here, he's asked by Kenneth Neely to have a seat and join him for some French toast, with Kenneth telling Miles that he took the liberty of placing an order for him. And he tells Miles that Cletus Kasady didn't share with him this part of his plan, but he's sure that it's spectacular, because in a way this kind of reminds Neely of the Last Supper, since this entire illusion, including the French toast, is part of Kasady's extremis Grendel symbiote, which currently is his body. And Neely's actually eating this stuff, so it's wild, but for Miles it's a hard pass. And then suddenly, without warning, Kasady jumps on Miles and he takes a bite, which seems to be something that Kasady brought along with him from his time with Carnage, with him still having the ability to bypass Miles' spider sense, but also with Kasady sinking his teeth into Miles. He's not directly going for the kill, because as Miles would describe it, Kasady would much rather break your mind and soul first, which sounds about right. And while Kasady is snacking on Miles, Neely is just happy to have had a meal for the first time in weeks, even if the whole thing was made out of symbiote. Which I guess is better to him than the scraps he's been munching on. But you gotta be a different kind of animal to just be out here eating Extrembiote McGrindles, even if they taste just like French toast. He's still wildin' for that one. But with Miles being in excruciating pain, he's eventually able to wiggle his way out of Kasady's bite. But after getting an up-close look at what Kasady's become now, Miles is very certain that this is not Carnage. In the way that he describes Kasady's look, he says it looks like Carnage threw up on Iron Man. Which is funny because it reminds me of one of you guys saying that Kasady now looks like a Swamp Thing Iron Man amalgamation, which for me, that's the description I like a bit more. But with Miles attempting to evade Kasady, he's knocked into another room where now he gets a second to catch his breath and also pick out the broken teeth that are still in his shoulder. But while Miles is here, he sees Dominic, who we first met in Carnage issue 12, hiding in the corner, whispering to get Miles' attention so he can get him out of here. Meanwhile, outside, we see Agent Gao stopping Sergeant Ahmed from calling the mayor and getting the Avengers out here. And as a really quick backstory on Agent Gao, she's been given the task of putting together a strike force to enforce the Powers Act, which kinda has a Suicide Squad vibe to it, but the description that we're given, it's more like the Thunderbolts, but closer to a street level version. And as it stands, Agent Gao, she kinda does things her own way, and she doesn't want Mayor Cage sticking his nose in it. But as part of her strike force, she's also recruited Mac Gargan, who's probably the last person that you're thinking wants to be here after what happened the last time he faced Kasady. But Gargan very much wants to get involved because he wants to get some payback for the way that Kasady did him in Absolute Carnage. But when Gargan and his team make their way into the building, they hear whispers in the walls saying over here, no over here, which just has these dudes freaking out, to where then Kasady just reaches out from the wall, grabbing one of these guys, and it quickly just turns into this terrifying massacre where another one of them is just shooting at Kasady and saying, I got him, only for another Kasady to come out from the wall behind him and spin his top. And for a moment we get the notion that these guys aren't complete idiots because they use Sonics, which are usually your guaranteed go-to versus a symbiote. But unfortunately, going into this, these guys just aren't aware of the fact that Kasady is already surrounding them from every angle, which really is the curtain call for Gargan's men. But Scorpion, on the other hand, he just goes after any and every Kasady that he sees popping up, telling them all that he's not afraid. And it's kind of messed up how when Kasady sees Gargan, he's just like, hiya Mac, good to see you back on your feet. To where then Scorpion's tail just clears the room. And off to the side, you still have Kenneth Neely, who's sitting in a chair just watching, front row at the Cletus Kasady show. And at first, Scorpion thinks that he's one of the survivors, but Neely clears that up quick because Carnage doesn't really do the survivors thing. So Scorpion's like, yep, that checks out. So Neely tells Scorpion his whole backstory on how he used to be the artist, but now he's leaving that to the professionals. And Scorpion's more or less like, alright, cool story bro, let's go to jail. Meanwhile, over with Miles, we find that he's taking Dominic to the roof to get him out of there. And in his mind, Miles is kind of like, okay, one step closer to getting Dominic to safety. But at the same time, he's kind of like, or am I trying to just get further away from Kasady? So he lets Dominic know that what they're gonna do is jump, but Dominic lets him know that he can't jump that far. But Miles tells him that he can. So he reaches back for Dominic's hand, and he tells him to trust him. But when Dominic reaches back, it's not Dominic, but instead it was Cletus Kasady this whole time. Cause like we knew, Kasady didn't leave any survivors. And now for Miles, with him quickly taking down this imposter with the hopes of getting out of here and calling the big guns, he's then hit by another Cletus who pops up behind him and slashes his back. And Kasady just tells Miles that he's out of his depth, and he asks him, "What's it like to know you're about to die? What's it like knowing your whole family's next?" And coming from behind Kasady, Scorpion steps in, saving Miles, which at first has Miles asking him why is he helping him. And Scorpion tells him he didn't plan on it because he thought the other Spider-Man was here, so more or less if it was Peter, he would have let him die. But suddenly Scorpion's stabbed in the back because Cletus Kasady is just the gift that keeps on giving. But Cletus even goes as far as to tell Scorpion about back when he broke his back, that wasn't nothing personal because he had to get his codex so he could wake up a god. But while he was in there doing the back breaking part, Kasady tells him that that part was just because he was bored. And with Scorpion, yet again at the mercy of Kasady, he lets Miles know that he's sorry, and he tells Miles that it's all on him. So Miles then musters up what strength he has left, and he charges up his Venom Blast, knowing that this is one of those moments where you face a monster and you don't hold back. And he punches Kasady right on top of that arc reactor, which quickly causes the Symbiote to go unstable. And this whole time Kasady is still making his threats on how he's gonna peel Miles as soon as he gets himself together. But Miles just tells Scorpion, we gotta get out of here, he's gonna blow. And at the last second, Kasady's like, wait, what's an arc reactor? Just before he overloads and lights up the Brooklyn sky. But even still, the Cletus Kasady show is far from over. Alright, so for this one, we come back just after Cletus Kasady's overload, which leveled the entire building above Todd's diner, sending both Miles and Scorpion tumbling all the way from the rooftop down to the sewers underneath, which is a long way. But now with these guys covered in debris, they're forced to work together to get out of this, which Miles has no problem with, but Scorpion on the other hand, he's like, I'm not doing the team thing. And again, these guys have to work together or they're just stuck down here. So Miles takes the first step by lifting up the debris so Scorpion can get a better angle to help Miles out. But when Scorpion climbs out, he just gives Miles this dirty look, like he's getting ready to double cross him, and Miles calls him out like, hey man, I don't like that look. Then suddenly Scorpion uses his tail to snatch Miles out before the debris falls on him, and not so much out of the kindness of his heart, but rather because he doesn't want the death of Spider-Man to mess up his probation situation. And now with the two of them free, there's a bit of an argument, mostly because of Scorpion, since he wants to be the one to radio for backup and make it look like he got the situation under control, which he clearly doesn't. And while they're arguing, suddenly they hear a voice calling for help, letting them know that they're down there and they're trapped. And right away, Scorpion's thinking this is Kasady, this is another trick. But Miles doesn't want to take that chance, so he at least tries to help this lady out, while Scorpion cautiously hangs back, waiting for her to transform into Cletus Kasady, like the last person Miles tried to help. Meanwhile, when we head up top to Agent Gao, who's being told by Captain Ahmed that it's likely Cletus Kasady was killed in the blast, Agent Gao's not buying it, because in a short story that we were given called Dead to Rights, which took us all the way back to Maximum Carnage, this gave us the reason why Agent Gao has a chip on her shoulder and a grudge towards Cletus Kasady, because at the time both her and Detective John Shade found themselves in the path of a fight between Carnage, Venom, and Spider-Man, where at the time Shade had been knocked out of the way while Gao was covering for Park as he called for backup. But suddenly, when Spider-Man came flying into one of the police cars, Gao went over to Spidey trying to wake him up, only for Carnage to then snatch Park and kill him, which is a death that Gao still blames herself for to this day, when really, to be honest, there's nothing she could have done at the time, because it seems to be more the case of her having survivor's guilt, since she was the last man standing, so to speak, which is why going forward into the present day, she wants to make sure that Park's death meant something. And as we continue, we'll see and learn more about how she's going about this, because even though this started with Cletus Kasady, Agent Gao really doesn't care for supers at all. She only sees them as a target or a means to an end. And right now, with her having a hunch that Cletus Kasady is still out there somewhere, she sees this as the worst possible outcome, because initially Kasady was contained in this building, but now there's no telling where he could be. And with her being informed that her men lost contact with Scorpion, she makes a phone call for her backup to come in. Meanwhile, back down under in the sewers, Miles and Scorpion hear yet another person who's trapped. And now Scorpion's like, man, you gotta be kidding me. Can we just get out of here? But yet again, Miles refuses to leave anyone behind. So he rushes in to get this guy out from under the rubble. So from there they can figure out how to get the four of them back up to the streets. And it isn't long before Miles comes up with an idea of using the water pressure to carry all of them back up to the street, which is mad risky, but it's really their only option right now. And even with Scorpion trying to talk him out of it, Miles just webs up the other two and he tells Scorpion that he got this, because there's really no time to keep going back and forth, lest they miss this opportunity, which could be their only one. So Miles tells everyone to hold their breath, because they definitely don't want to swallow this water. So next, Miles kicks the compromised leaking wall, which spews out a ton of water, shooting the four of them back up to the street, where now there's a brief moment of celebration, with Miles saving Scorpion himself along with the paramedic and the other soldier, only for this to be cut short when Agent Gal steps in, telling the officers to handcuff Spider-Man. Which again, for Gal, it just goes back to how much she hates supers, cause the paramedic he saved. She tells Gal if it wasn't for Spider-Man they wouldn't have got out. And Scorpion even puts the word in, telling Gal that Spider-Man can prove to be useful, cause he did good back there. And he even goes as far as to let Agent Gal know that the building came down because of Kasady, not Spider-Man. But during this time, the fourth person they brought up to the top, he's been really quiet. So the paramedic, she goes to check on him, only to find that he was Cletus Kasady this whole time. Though in this case, we're told that it's more like Kasady possessed Scott and used him as a distraction. So it's a little different than what we saw in Carnage Reigns Alpha, where he was shapeshifting and posing as his previous victims. But with Miles seeing Kasady come back, he breaks out of his handcuffs easily, and he goes after Kasady, only to find him electrocuted by somebody else and hit with multiple arrows, which now introduces the help that Agent Gal had mentioned earlier, with them being Electro, Taskmaster, and a speedster named Hightail, all of whom being members of Gal's team called the Cape Killers, where in their case, let's be honest, Marvel's once again doing their version of the Suicide Squad, which to me is not a bad thing, because Marvel and DC have been stealing ideas from each other for decades, so I don't mind it. But what they really need as far as this idea goes is a concept that hits and sticks around for a substantial amount of time, because to me the closest they've gotten is with the version of the Thunderbolts, but aside from that, we'll see this idea float around for a little bit and next thing you know, poof, it's gone. And I mean, this could be the same case, who knows? But nonetheless, with these Cape Killers showing up, they stop Kasady quickly, only to find out that the real Cletus Kasady got away. So Agent Gal tells Miles that he can either go to jail or join the Cape Killers until Kasady's handled, and she'll consider that to be his time served, which is messed up, but again, that's how Agent Gal works, like Amanda Waller, but in Marvel. And from here, next, going into Carnage issue 13, we find Kenneth Neely making his way through the sewers, looking for Kasady, while also thinking about how the things that are happening here in Carnage Reigns are a byproduct of him provoking Cletus Kasady to leave St. Est's orphanage and get back to his murderous ways in hopes of bringing out the Kasady that he needs to go after Carnage. But instead, like we'd seen, Carnage Reigns has turned into its own thing, and it's quickly become more than what Neely had in mind. But eventually he finds Kasady at the Spire, miles beneath New York City, and it's here where Kasady lets him know when he initially took the Symbiote from Tony Stark, he didn't have any plans for it, he just did it to prove a point, because at the time during Extreme Carnage, Kasady and the Carnage Symbiote were still a thing. And with Neely hearing Kasady bring up the Carnage Symbiote, he tries to steer the conversation back towards them going after Carnage, only for Kasady to let Ken know that he needs to get fixed up, because after Miles hit him with that Venom Blast, it messed up something in the Symbiote to where now Kasady feels like he has a microwave cooking him from the inside out. However, when Miles did this, it gave Cletus an idea, because for a moment he was connected, he was the wires, and now this has him thinking. Instead of using the Hive to remake the world in his own image, leaning further into the technology of the Symbiote just might prove to be a more versatile option. So Neely asks him, like, okay, well, what's the next move? And Kasady tells him, since his Symbiote needs repair, he's got to take it down to the shop, much like a vehicle if it needed a spark plug. And as they head out, we then go back over to the Carnage Symbiote, where like we'd seen last, it's going through the memories of Detective Shade. And though it looks like the Carnage Symbiote is cutting open Detective Shade, it's really not. This is just how Shade's mind has put together this moment, since Shade doesn't want to be a suitable host for the Carnage Symbiote, which is something we're only given a glimpse of during Carnage Reigns, just to let us know what the Carnage Symbiote and Jonathan Shade are up to since we've seen them last. Well, going back to Cletus Kasady, him and Neely make their way to Stark Unlimited HQ, making an entrance that is anything but subtle. And as soon as they get here, Kasady is demanding that somebody takes him straight to Tony Stark, only for him to quickly find out that Tony Stark no longer runs this company, because now the company is being ran by Kelvin Hang as the result of a hostile takeover that now gives Orchis access to Stark Unlimited, which was initially done because Hang, or Fei Long, dedicated his second IPO to the promise of planet-sized innovations in biology and climate science, which at the time set his sights on the promise of taking humanity to Mars. But the aftermath of Hickman's Avengers and X-Men Red ruined this opportunity for him, with the Avengers squandering the opportunity and the mutants seizing it before he could when they colonized Mars, which eventually led Fei Long to collaborating with Orchis and his hostile takeover of Stark Industries, which just made sense because of his hatred for Tony Stark and mutants. But for Kasady, with him just strolling into Stark Unlimited, he's not aware of none of this. And unfortunately, when he asks one of these robot scientists, his words, to repair the repulsor in his chest, they're not able to do it because Stark's armor specs were never shared with the engineers. And for that reason, they haven't the slightest idea on how an Symbiote works. But it isn't long until Kasady sees one of the Stark Sentinels, and right away he knows that he wants them to put him in one of those, with these engineers having no idea if the Symbiote will even accept the Stark Sentinel's components, but they do it anyway because they know if they don't, he gonna kill him. So Kasady requests that they give him access to the online system, and while he's being worked on, he tells Neely that he needs him to watch his 6, so he gives Neely a piece of his symbiote along with some extra Stark parts that are just laying around, which at first for Neely it has him thinking that he's finally being acknowledged after all this, and he's finally being rewarded for everything he's went through. But Kasady quickly lets him know that he will be in complete control of Neely's body, because the only person he can truly trust to watch his own back is himself. But soon after this is done, a green blur strikes Neely, revealing that Hightail and the Cape Killers have made their way there. So Kasady quickly puts Neely to use so that he can hold them off and give the scientists enough time to get the Stark Sentinel operating so that Kasady can create this new version of his hive. And as it turns out, Kasady's plans for distracting Miles and the others, it's very effective, because at one point he locks Electro inside of some old Stark armor, which isn't as well insulated on the inside, which I mean, I don't know if this would even harm Electro, but at least we're not going back to the whole sprinkler system thing, which was really Max Dillon's greatest foe for decades. But now with the science done and Kaiju Kasady powered up, Miles attempts to hit him with the Venom Blast because it worked last time. But this go round, Miles just bounces right off of him as Kasady uses this Stark Sentinel to inject himself into the building's neural network, which again, this is the idea that Kasady got when Miles hit him with the Venom Blast. And just before he overloaded, Kasady saw the potential of this Symbiote, which changed his mind, with Kasady believing that this is the greater method for him to remake the world in his image. Alright, so jumping back into Carnage Reigns, where at this time Cletus Kasady's used the Symbiote-infused Stark Sentinel to expand his Grendel abilities through the internet so that he can possess a larger number of people than what we've seen so far at Todd's Diner and with Kenneth Neely. But before we see this carried out, we're also shown that there's a few Cletus Kasady stands who are online talking to each other on some sort of forum or thread, and they've been following the recent news of what's been going on with Cletus Kasady since the massacre at Todd's Diner. And now with Kasady connected to the web, he's starting to send out video calls that allow him to control people, which is something that these guys were made aware of, with calls going out to people nearby them. Though at this point, none of these guys have received the call, which causes them to speculate for a moment as far as why Kasady's doing this, and one of them takes a guess that it's probably because Kasady wants to eat them, only for another one to respond that he's actually okay with that, which is wild. But from here, we then head over to Liz Allen's apartment, where we find Kasady trying to reach out to her while using Flash Thompson's name on the caller ID to make sure that she picks up, but instead the phone's answered by her stepson, Stanley Osborn, who's the son of the clone of Harry Osborn and Lily Hollister. And as soon as Kasady gets Stanley on the phone, he tells Stanley to put the phone up good and close to his ear so that he could tell him the most biggest epic secret in the whole wide world, which of course, like we were told, this is just Kasady's new method of controlling others by way of video call. So next he gets Stanley to grab a Chucky-sized knife and go after Liz while she's taking a bubble bath with her earbuds in, which is why she can't hear him come in or nothing like that. But fortunately, Normie's able to step in and stop the mind-controlled Stanley from sending Liz to the upper room. And right away, Kasady sees Normie and he brings up his past as Goblin Child, as well as his current situation with Normie recently becoming the Red Goblin, which are all videos that I have linked down in the comments below, starting with Norman Osborn still in the Carnage Symbiote, as well as Dark Web and the current Venom series. Because through the course of these events, Dylan gave Normie the symbiote so that he could help Dylan in the upcoming Symbiote War, which is still a ways down the line. And with Normie getting the symbiote, he named it Rascal, but he's still learning how to handle its unique abilities. And now, with Normie seeing that they have to deal with Cletus Kasady, he's not exactly sure if they're up to the task. And right now, Cletus, he's trying to get Normie to look at the phone so that he can be the next puppet, only for a sudden explosion to then go off outside, showing Normie and Rascal that Cletus Kasady is already taking control of a large number of civilians in the area, which from here seamlessly takes us back over to the Cape Killers, who are trying to contain these mind-controlled people within the area without using any lethal methods, which is kinda hard for Electro, cause she's practically trying to hold people back with lightning, which causes her to ask, where is Scorpion and why isn't he helping with the containment part? And for us, that's an answer that we get rather quickly, cause back over at Stark Unlimited Tower, Kasady and Gargan are kind of in the middle of a conversation, with Kasady telling him how what he's doing is truly setting these people free, with Kasady making them act out violent desires that these people have been had for each other, that otherwise they would have never done. And I gotta give it to Scorpion here, because even in the face of what seems to be certain death, he just lets Kasady know that this is gonna end for him the same way it usually does, with him losing. And Cletus tells him in response, if it is, you ain't gonna be alive to see it, only for Scorpion to then be saved by Agent Gal, who's able to shoot him free just in the nick of time. And from here, when Scorpion asks Gal how bad is it, she lets him know that Kasady's consciousness has been contained to this area, because the network that he's using is an old Stark Escape network, which for the most part just reaches throughout New York. But on their way out, Gal then gets a call from Fei Long, who once again is the new owner of Stark Unlimited, where here not only do we find out that he's the person who's been providing Agent Gal's special division with their gear, but also he's calling to let her know that he's sending in a couple of Stark Sentinels to help her and the Cape Killers get things under control. Meanwhile, back on the ground, we see that Normie's made his way out, suited up as the Red Goblin after locking his little brother in the broom closet to keep him safe, or at least keep him away from his mom Liz, since her self-care Sundays take about 2 hours. So Normie's hoping that that's enough time for him to get Stanley back to normal and get back home to his mom. But while he's down here trying to help with the crowd control, Miles comes crashing down fast and hard, which for Normie, though he doesn't really show it or express it with his words, he's fanning out a little bit, because for everyone who took after his grandfather with the mantle of Green Goblin, it's only corrupted them. But now with him seeing Brooklyn Spider-Man in action, up close, Normie's just like, look at this guy, he inspires greatness. And for Miles, he's just looking at Normie kinda like, who are you supposed to be? And Normie just lets him know that he's working on it, cause he hasn't made like an official name for himself. But mid-conversation, the two of them are attacked by Kenneth Neely, who once again is just another one of Kasady's puppets. So really and truly, this is Cletus Kasady, doing a bit of remote play with the attacks out here. And in this fight, Miles tries to just rip this armor and some of the symbiote off of Neely, so Kasady makes Neely take off, with his plan being that he's gonna take Miles so high that he won't have enough air to scream, let alone breathe. And on top of that, on their way up, Kasady's trying to bite Miles' head off, but to everyone's surprise, and especially Neely, cause if we're honest, he was getting ready to die too. But to everyone's surprise, Normie grabs a hold of Neely's legs, and he uses Rascal's unique symbiote power to absorb the symbiote that Kasady gave to Neely, effectively saving Miles and Neely, bringing them both back down to the ground. So Kasady, who's pissed, he sends a ton of nearby civilians after Miles and Normie, only for a huge blast to come in, knocking all these people away, which initially has Miles hoping that this is the Avengers showing up. But instead, it's the 2 Stark Sentinels that was sent here by Fei Long to help take down Cletus Kasady, who we then jump back over to, heading into Carnage issue 14, where now Kasady's thinking some things over, starting with the Carnage Symbiote, who's also out there becoming a god, even though the two of them define that word differently, as they both take very different approaches towards becoming a god after going their separate ways. And from here, Kasady then thinks about his current approach, with him tapping into Stark's old network, allowing him to mind control civilians in the area, which now makes him more dangerous than ever. But now he has the issue of the Osborn kid, who has the ability to absorb symbiote matter somehow, alongside of Miles Morales, who was able to hurt Kasady in the Extrembio, who, as it turns out, that's who Kasady's talking to right now. But with how this is done, Kasady sees it no different than him talking to a $20 hatchet from Home Depot, because when he's alone, he just talks to his tools, which he uses to turn everything into a mirror. And Kasady even admits that when he feels small, he just does the same old thing. He multiplies, much like in Carnage USA and Absolute Carnage. And all of this makes them predictable, it makes them vulnerable, and he thinks perhaps that's the reason why he always loses. So he decides here that changing his tactics, that's not the solution, but instead he's just been thinking too small. He's been trying to reach millions instead of trillions. So now Kasady plans to use these Iron Man armors to build a bigger mirror. And from here we head over to Midtown for a moment, where we find Kenneth Neely, who's been taken in by Agent Gao. And he just looks crazy here, mumbling on about how Carnage used him and Kasady used him. And now Gao is just looking at him like, okay, this guy's broken, he's shattered, just like anything Cletus Kasady touches. And alongside Agent Gao, we also have Fei Long here, who brought with him a nanotech that was specifically designed to remove symbiotic matter from inorganic systems, because the way he sees it, Agent Gao's been talking about Cletus Kasady the same way their ancestors would have spoken about the plague or genetic oddities. But to him, Kasady's not like an active god or a plague, he's just a problem. And he's a problem that Fei Long has the solution to. So from here he goes back to his hotel suite and he sends his commands to his Stark Sentinels. Meanwhile, in the case of Normie, he's been trying to manually absorb the Clintar sonic frequencies that Kasady has sent to these people through the phone, and it's starting to take its toll on him, because what he's taken out from them, it's all just been building up in his symbiote. And as for Fei Long's plan of sending these Stark Sentinels after Kasady and his Extrembio Sentinel, things get dicey rather quickly, because as soon as the two of them confirm that they're delivering the nanotech payload, seconds later they're reporting structural integrity compromised, which then has Fei Long kind of like, okay, this ain't looking good. While at this time, when we go back to Miles, Scorpion, and Normie, they're making their way up Stark Unlimited Tower so that they can get Normie closer to Kasady, in hopes of Normie's symbiote being able to absorb just enough to sever Kasady's connection and end this once and for all. And right now, with Kasady fighting off both of these Stark Sentinels, we then see that Fei Long's nanotech is successfully and fully offloaded, destroying Kasady's broadcast by cutting him off from Stark's old network, causing Kasady to be expelled from the Stark Sentinel. And he's not happy about it one bit. And Fei Long lets Cletus know, now that he's isolated, he's moving to the next step, which is elimination. And even though Kasady doesn't know whose voice that is, remotely speaking through the systems to him, he's just yelling out all the crazy things he's gonna do to that person when he finds out whose voice that was. But now with Kasady kicked out and weakened and looking crazy, Scorpion takes the fight right back to him, which is really nothing more than a distraction so that Normie can go after Kasady and hopefully just incapacitate him. And this whole time, Miles is right there with him, making sure that he's still with them and asking Normie over and over again if he's sure about this. But when Normie connects to Kasady, he says it's like staring into an endless ocean of cruelty. It overwhelms him and he tells Miles that he can't do it just before he crashes from the overload. So Miles just picks him up and he tells Scorpion that they gotta get out of there now. And he lets Normie know that it's okay, he did his best, but again, they gotta go. And with them really having nowhere to go up here, Miles tells Scorpion that they gotta just jump. And he asks Scorpion if he's ready, and Scorpion says nope. So Miles tells him, look at it this way, you can either jump out of this skyscraper or stick around and get eaten by that, which were words that worked well enough to get Scorpion moving. But it's funny because from here, with Kasady leaving Stark Unlimited, or at least stepping outside in his new look, you got the Cletus stands making comments online like, Daddy Cletus got thick with 2 C's. But with seeing this and what happens next, this brings us to the next phase of what Kasady was talking about when he pointed at the Iron Man armor and went on to mention that he needs to build a bigger mirror. And with Kasady losing his access to Tony's old network, he still has the Extrembio. So as it turns out, he sent away 3 different Iron Man armors, one to Queens, one to New Jersey, one to Staten Island, each going out to one of his 3 stands. who we saw before watching the news and just hoping that Kasady would reach out. So he approaches them all, telling them that they are his insurance, which is something that they couldn't be more excited about. And meanwhile, also in New Jersey, a very pissed off Tony Stark has been made aware of what's going on, with Kasady using his tech to terrorize the neighborhood. So he suits up to make his way down there and make sure that Kasady doesn't get away with this. Alright, so going into the conclusion of Carnage Reigns, we begin with the 3 Cletus Kasady stands who have now come together, meeting up in Jamaica, Queens to see if they can figure out how to actually use these Iron Man suits that Kasady gave them. But while they're inspecting the Symbiote infused merchandise, Kasady activates them, suits them up, and gets them heading towards the fight. Where now, back in Manhattan, Symbiote Kasady is giving Miles and the other Cape Killers a run for their money. And the only person who's shown the potential of being able to stop Kasady is the Red Goblin, and he's out cold. So Miles is trying to get him to safety while really everyone else is just trying to do what they can. And for a moment, Taskmaster gets a lift from Electro so he can get a better angle for his arrows, but this really doesn't do anything aside from annoying Kasady even more. So he then sets his sight on Taskmaster and Electro. So Taskmaster tells Electro she needs to speed up because Kasady's closing in fast. So to speed things up, she drops the dead weight, which was him. To where next she makes her way to Miles and tells him to give her his hand so he can charge her up with his bioelectricity so she can send it right to Kasady. And with the way this is done, I'm surprised she wasn't just like Kamehame, because the delivery and the blast both come off like there's just heavy Dragon Ball inspiration going on here. But this blast did not take out Kasady, and it didn't faze him nearly as much as Miles' Venom blast back at the diner, which just goes to show how much stronger Kasady is now. And he doesn't waste any time getting his lick back, with him taking a slice out of Electro, which also knocks her off the building, though fortunately Hightail's there to catch her. And for Taskmaster, it's like he couldn't wait to tell Electro that's what she gets for dropping him earlier. But also Taskmaster managed to swipe a little something from Stark Unlimited that he wanted to test out, which really is just an RPG that he's hoping is gonna have some kind of extra Stark tech on it that'll stop Kasady once and for all. But when he lets it off, Kasady just swats it towards a building, endangering a number of civilians. So Miles and Hightail team up and get over there quick so that she can throw the people out to him and he can web them up safely before they're crushed in all the debris, which is a quick plan that worked out rather nicely. But the funny thing is, with Miles catching all these civilians and webbing them up safely, Scorpion then just comes crashing down after attempting to take on Kasady solo, which now just leaves Miles and Hightail versus Kasady, with Agent Gao radioing in like, you two better hold the line. And to make things worse, Sergeant Ahmed lets Agent Gao know they got 3 Stark Tech energy signatures heading their way, and they're older models at that. And Agent Gao really doesn't know what this means. Not fully, not yet. And not too long after, her and some of her men come in for air support. But while they're trying to help Miles, Hightail, and Scorpion, the pilot tells her that they're picking up something on the radar. And at first, Gao thinks it's the 3 incoming Stark relics, which I mean, she's halfway right, cause it's Tony Stark, who's a relic in his own right. But this Dragon Slayer armor that Tony's wearing, it's brand new. And from the moment that Tony shows up, he's hitting Kasady with all kind of sonics, blasts, constructs, you name it. Because ever since Kasady took the Symbiote from Tony, he had been planning for this moment when Kasady would return with it, which is also why this titanium armor that Tony's wearing is themed like a knight. Since, you know, the Symbiote is a symbiote dragon, so who better to slay the dragon than a knight in shining armor from a long time ago. And Tony's not playing any games. He cranks up the power because he wants Kasady to feel this. But also by using so much juice, Tony completely drains his power cells, which then causes him to come crashing down. So he asks Miles to give him a jump, and just like that, Tony's back up. And it's cool to see because Miles Morales, he ain't no Kevin Gates. But if you need a jump, he'll get you going with just a touch. But in the middle of this conversation, Kasady catches Miles slipping from behind by running an Symbiote scythe right through him, only to then take off and leave, while telling them that he's done with the small fry and that he needs to bite at something bigger. He needs to spread this thing far and wide. He needs to spread real carnage, which now leaves Miles bleeding out with a punctured lung and broken ribs. So Tony tells him to stay still, because this is gonna sting a lot, as Tony gives Miles what he calls a special cast to speed up his recovery process, which will both keep him protected and keep his vitals up, with Miles now having a brand new Iron Spider suit, which looks so good. But as soon as Miles gets it, him and Tony go right after Kasady, with there really being no time to just stop and appreciate how good the new spider armor looks. Which makes sense because Kasady's the priority right now. But I also gotta say, if nothing else, Carnage Reigns has brought some nice looking drip scattered around here and there. And you already know I'm a sucker for some new skins or fresh colorway, so more often than not, I'ma welcome the new additions. But getting back to it, with Tony and Miles catching up with Kasady, they hit him hard. And Kasady hits back, which is a counter that knocked Tony and Miles into a building, which causes Tony to stop for a second and call for a huddle, where he then lets the team know if they can get him inside of that thing, he can take down Kasady for good. And it's a plan that doesn't initially sit well with Miles, because he doesn't want to kill anybody, even someone like Cletus Kasady. But Tony lets him know they might not even have that choice this time, and after that he calls for his temporary Avengers to assemble so they can go and slay this dragon. Which at the end, that was really Tony doing a bit of fast talk so he ain't gotta go back and forth with Miles. But while the team is tearing into Kasady, Cletus lets out a call for all the civilians under his control, as well as his new team of Iron Men, to assemble and take on Dragon Slayer Tony and his temporary Avengers. So Agent Gal, with her seeing the mismatch from above, she sends the Red Goblin back into the fight, which now just has her up in the chopper with the pilot and Kenneth Neely. But down on the ground, when Tony sees these other suits, his throwback suits laced with Symbiote material, it's just causing the technical side of him to have so many questions, because at a glance he doesn't understand how they're powered, or even how Cletus got his hands on those older suits in particular. But he doesn't think about it too long before him and Miles gotta fight them off, and eventually Tony activates Earmuff Protocol, which automatically covers Miles' ears too, to where next Tony uses a heavy sonic attack that just blasts the Kasady stands out of their suits. And also with seeing this, Tony tells Miles that the real Cletus Kasady's long gone, and all that's really left is a mess of tech and a number of compounds fighting for control, in hopes of helping Miles understand that Cletus Kasady's already dead. So what they're planning to do is not like they're actually killing him. Meanwhile, with Agent Gal, Kenneth Neely sees his opportunity when a piece of one of the Symbiote Iron Men splashed on the window of the chopper, so he bonds with that piece. He grabs the pilot and he sends the chopper going down fast. Cause for Neely, the way he sees it, Cletus can't lose here today because Neely needs him to go after Carnage. So this guy's wildin', he's a man on a mission. So he sends the chopper going down as he smacks Agent Gal out of it, which now sets off Miles' spider sense since they got a chopper incoming. So he quickly hops to it and he saves Agent Gal. But we'll have to wait and see if any of this contributes towards changing her mind as far as the way that she feels about supers, cause Miles and Tony could have just got out the way. And with Neely making his way to Kasady, Neely lets him know that he got his message. He understands his purpose now, and he tells Kasady even if he beats Iron Man and Spider-Man here, Carnage is still out there in the stars, waiting. But Cletus more or less takes this as a sign of disrespect, because he's not going to let Neely tell him what he can and can't do. So he takes back the piece of the Symbiote that Neely has on him, for Kasady to get himself nearly back to full power, only for him to then impale a dazed and confused Kenneth Neely and absorb him into himself, while telling Neely, come on, you had to know it was going to end this way. So next, Tony tells Miles to buy him some time so that Tony can prep the air quotes nuclear option, which at first Miles thought he was talking about literally. But no, it's the same EMP plan, and he lets Miles know that he's gonna need at least 5 minutes. And as Miles goes back to Kasady to keep him busy, Neely's speaking to Kasady from the Hive, telling him how he's incomplete without the Carnage Symbiote, and how what Kasady is now is nothing compared to what the Carnage Symbiote has become. And it's a lot for Kasady to handle, with him having to juggle fighting Iron Spider Miles Morales and listen to Neely, who's even annoying in death. And this is something that Miles takes full advantage of, even though he doesn't know what exactly is going on as far as the conversation between Neely and Kasady, cause for Miles he thinks it's just the extra training that's causing him to do so good all of a sudden. Which to me, I'm kinda like, I don't think so. And I mean maybe a little, but I'm pretty sure the new suit as well as Kasady slowing down because of Neely have something to do with it as well. But either way, doesn't matter, because the 5 minutes are up and Tony's back. So he goes full speed right into Kasady's chest, because now that his ultimate's charged up, he can hit the EMP full power purge from the inside and blast Kasady into pieces. Which for Tony, this is another one of those things that's just a one-off. So his suit's practically fried, and he's not able to do a scan for any signs of life to make sure that Kasady's gone. So Tony just eyeballs it, and he's like, Kasady looks pretty gone to me. Because now the civilians are all coming back to their senses, and any signs of Symbiote matter seems to have been fried, which now pretty much wraps up Carnage Reigns. But there's one more thing that happens here that I am not happy about. And it's the fact that before Tony leaves, he takes back the Iron Spider suit, which right there just had me like, man, can your boy just hold it for a few more issues? Or at least let him rock it through the next event coming up? Like, come on. But nope, Tony just tells Miles it's more like a, break the glass in case of emergency type of thing. And that's that. So from here, Tony gives Miles a ride back to Brooklyn, which I guess is the least he can do, which now gets Miles back to his family. But back over at the blast site, we see that there's still a small puddle of extrymbiote goo with a face emerging from it, which lets us know that the larger story yet continues. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below where you can go to patreon.com/DopeSpill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.